Hello, curious people. Today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So, before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable. Now, I stepped into the stories. If I'm being honest, I ignored the warning signs. I mean, wouldn't you? Sharon was perfect, or at least, she seemed perfect at the time. She's beautiful in that classic way that makes people stop and stare. Smart too. She's got a dry sense of humor that could cut glass, and she knows exactly how to use it. We've been dating for 8 months now, and yeah, maybe it was a little fast, but everything just clicked. From our first date, I knew I wanted her in my life. She felt like the total package, someone I could actually see myself building a future with. Looking back, there were little things I should have paid more attention to. It started on our 4th date. We were sitting on her couch, drinking wine, when she brought it up. "I should probably warn you about something," she said, swirling her glass. I raised an eyebrow, already half in love with her. "Oh, what's that?" "I'm not the easiest person to sleep next to," she said. I laughed, thinking she was making a joke. "Don't worry. I've shared a bed with snorers before. I think I can handle it." She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's not just snoring. I talk in my sleep. Sometimes I move around, or, well, I've even been known to slap people by accident." "Slap people, huh? Sounds like an occupational hazard," I teased. She gave me this look, half serious, half amused. "I'm just saying, it's happened before. If you decide to stick around, you've been warned." At the time, I didn't think much of it. It sounded harmless, even kind of cute. But looking back, yeah, I should have taken her more seriously. The first time I stayed over at her place, I was anticipating a slap in my sleep, just so I could poke fun at her about it the next morning. But for the most part, that first night was uneventful. She tossed and turned a little, muttering what sounded like random gibberish. "Not the red one, and don't let it fall." I barely noticed. Over the next few weeks, her quirks started to come out more. One night, I woke up to her hand smacking me squarely in the chest. "What the hell?" I mumbled, groggy and confused. Sharon was still asleep, her arm falling limp against the bed. The next morning, I brought it up over breakfast. "So, you hit me last night?" She almost choked on her coffee, her eyes wide with mock horror. "I did?" "Yup. Full on. Smack. Guess you were dreaming about fighting someone." She grinned, shaking her head. "Maybe I was dreaming about Aaron." Aaron was her ex-husband. She didn't talk about him much, but from what I gathered, their divorce had been messy. The way she said his name, half joking, half bitter, made me wonder if there was more to the story. Still, I laughed it off. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. The warnings kept coming, however, in subtle ways I didn't recognize for what they were. A few weeks into staying over, Sharon brought it up again one night as we got into bed. "I wasn't kidding about the sleep stuff, you know," she said. "I know," I replied, pulling the covers over us. "Honestly, it's not that bad. It's sort of adorable." Her smile faltered for just a second. "Just don't freak out if I say something weird, okay?" I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Sharon, it's no trouble, really. I think you're perfect, and nothing you say in your sleep is going to change that." She smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Now I wish I'd taken that moment more seriously. The first few weeks of staying at Sharon's place were normal enough. Sure, she moved a lot in her sleep, tossing, turning, even mumbling, but I figured it was just part of her quirky charm. But then her topics of conversation changed dramatically. At first, she'd say things like, "Put that down," or "Get the cat." Harmless nonsense, and I'd laugh about it the next morning. But one night, about a month in, I woke up to something different. "It's under the oak tree," Sharon murmured, her voice low and steady. I blinked, groggy and confused. "Sharon?" She didn't respond. Her body was still, her breathing slow and even. I sat up and leaned closer. "What's under the oak tree?" "Nothing." She didn't say anything else, just rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The next morning, over breakfast, I brought it up. "You said something weird in your sleep last night," I told her. Sharon raised an eyebrow, sipping her coffee. "Oh yeah? What did I say?" "It was strange. You said, 'It's under the oak tree.'" She tilted her head like she was trying to figure out if I was joking. "Huh, that's weird. Maybe it was about a treehouse or something." When she finally rolled over and went quiet, I got up and went to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water. What the hell was going on? The breaking point came a few nights later. I woke up to Sharon sitting at the edge of the bed, her back to me. "I told you it wouldn't work," she whispered. I sat up slowly. "Sharon." She didn't turn around. Her head tilted slightly, like she was listening to someone I couldn't see. "He said he'd take care of it, but he didn't. Now it's my problem." "Sharon, who are you talking to?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and walked out of the bedroom. I didn't follow her. I just sat there, frozen, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. When I woke up the next morning, she was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. I forced a smile, but my stomach churned. I couldn't stop thinking about the things she'd said in her sleep. The night I realized something was really wrong started like any other. Sharon fell asleep quickly, curled up on her side, while I stayed awake scrolling on my phone. Everything seemed normal until I heard her voice. At first, I thought she was speaking to me. "I held his nose shut," she said. I froze. Her voice was low, cold, almost monotone. It didn't take long. He kicked for a while, but then he stopped. I turned to her. Sharon was still lying on her side, breathing slowly. "Sharon?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Her voice dropped to a whisper, dragged him down the embankment. The soil was soft, perfect for digging. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I confronted her. "You were talking in your sleep again last night." Sharon glanced up from her coffee, looking amused. "Oh, no, really? What did I say this time? I hope it wasn't anything embarrassing." I hesitated. You said something about suffocating someone and digging a grave." She frowned. "That's weird. Maybe a nightmare about one of those crime shows I watch. You know how much Netflix I binge." She laughed. but it didn't feel genuine. You don't remember what you were dreaming about, I pressed. Sharon shook her head. No, sorry. Honestly, Chris, I never remember any of my dreams. I nodded, but I suspected she wasn't telling me everything. A few nights later, I woke up to her voice again. Max, she said. Her tone was calm, detached. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. He's behind the old barn, she continued, the one with the blue door. The name was familiar. A young man named Max had gone missing years ago while on a camping trip. His case was still unsolved. The next morning, I didn't bring it up. I didn't know how to, but I couldn't get the name or her words out of my head. I Googled Max's name on my phone. His disappearance had happened in the next county over. There was no mention in the reports of a barn or a blue door, but the other details Sharon had mentioned matched the description of the area where he'd last been seen. A few days later, I worked up the courage to suggest something to Sharon. She was grinning when I first approached. Have you ever thought about doing a sleep study? I asked carefully. Her smile faded. Why would I do that, Chris? I don't know. Just, you've been saying some really strange things in your sleep. Maybe it's stress or something. I'm fine, she said, shaking her head. You're overthinking it. What about recording it? I said. Just so you can hear it for yourself. Her expression darkened instantly. No, absolutely not. That's a huge invasion of privacy. I wasn't trying to. If you ever record me without my permission, Chris, we're done. I mean it. Our eyes met. I nodded, and we went on with our day. Inside, however, my world was unraveling. That night, after she fell asleep, I couldn't help myself. I propped my phone under a pillow on her side of the bed and hit record. The next morning, while Sharon was in the shower, I played back the audio file. At first, it was just static. Then, around 2 a.m., her voice came through, clear as day. Nina screamed too much, Sharon murmured. Fast had to move fast. No mistakes. I froze. Nina. I knew her too. A teenager by that name had disappeared 5 years ago, and her case was still open. No, it couldn't be, I thought. This isn't impossible. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know if what she was saying was true. That afternoon, I drove to one of the locations Sharon had described. A barn with a blue door. It wasn't far, about 20 minutes outside of town. I found it easily enough. The building was old and weathered. Its door faded to a dull gray. Behind the barn was a small grove of trees. The soil beneath them looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently. I told myself, I can't stop seeing her face on the news. I can't stop hearing my mom's voice on the phone, shaking as she told me what happened. I could have done something. I could have stopped Sharon, but I didn't. I ran. My hands are shaking. My head is pounding, and my chest feels tight, but I have to get it out. I just need someone to know. Her name is Sharon. She's smart, beautiful, perfect on the outside, and she's a murderer. She's confessed to everything. Max, Nina, all of them. She described how she did it, where she buried them. I thought it was just dreams at first. God, I wanted to believe it was just dreams. But I found one of them. I dug where she said to dig, and there he was. I tried running. I thought if I stayed quiet, she'd let me go. but the killings never stopped. I suppose I want someone to know the truth before she finds me, because she will. It's just a matter of time. There's a noise. I freeze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I hear the sound of glass breaking, of footsteps, slow and steady, coming from the kitchen. A wave of nausea overwhelms me. I grab the gun from my nightstand, my hands trembling so badly I nearly drop it. Oh God, she's here. I don't know if I'll make it out of this. If I disappear, you'll know why. If anyone finds this, please, don't let her get away with it. Fuck HIPAA. My old patient just tried to kidnap me, and it's even crazier than it sounds. In 1346, a bizarre theater troupe rose to notoriety along the Italian peninsula. Contemporary accounts of their performances strain modern credulity. Claims include advanced pyrotechnics, reality-defying stunts, extraordinarily well-crafted set pieces that the troupe routinely left behind to serve as shelter for local beggars, wild animals that even the most educated spectators could not name, and other elements that earned the troupe myriad accusations of witchcraft. The performances were so controversial, and the players themselves under such heavy suspicion, that arrest warrants were issued for members of the troupe in October 1347. Within days of the warrant's issuance, however, vermin carrying the bubonic plague arrived on ships inbound from Crimea and swiftly devastated the region. Records indicate that the troupe was similarly devastated, leaving only 4 survivors: the playwright of the troupe and his 3 children. Reports that the troupe, reformed, began to circulate in 1348, with the playwright as the head. Interestingly, these reports indicate that all new members of the troupe were children. Despite the young age of its members, the troupe gave performances as intricate and awe-inspiring as before. They were on the verge of success and close to earning the ire of the church and government authorities yet again, when the troupe fell victim to a second wave of the plague. Months later, the troupe apparently reformed a 3rd time. The playwright, who was recognizable due to his unusual height and striking red hair, was seen advertising a new performance throughout the city square. He successfully drew an audience for a performance that night. No one knows what the performance entailed, because every last member of the audience vanished. The following night, the playwright was seen advertising a second show alongside a particularly ragged little girl. Once again, they successfully drew a small crowd for the night's performance. Once again, every patron vanished. This continued for a total of 6 nights. Over the course of the show's run, a total of 407 people vanished. The playwright and his troupe were never seen again. As it turns out, the playwright is none other than inmate 17, Ward 1, the Harlequin. For additional context on this inmate, please view his primary file and his secondary file. The events outlined above were entirely unknown to staff at HNASQU prior to the afternoon of 1/1925, when the inmate insisted on an impromptu meeting with the agency's specialized interviewer, Rachele B. That's me. I would like to note that immediately following this interview, the inmate tried to kidnap me, and I believe his reason for doing so directly relates to the information he shared with me during the below interview, in order to most accurately describe the events as they unfolded. I've transcribed the inmate's interview first. and my direct related experience with him. Afterward, I would also like to note that I am still scared as all hell and will not be talking to this inmate again under any circumstances. Interview subject: the Harlequin classification. String: uncooperative, indestructible, Olympic, protean, critical, egregore. Interviewers: Rachele B. and Christoph W. Interview. Date: 1/19/2024. When I love, I become weak. This is why I enjoy everything while loving nothing. Unfortunately, love sometimes comes for you whether you want it or not. After I was exiled from my own city for the first time, it came for me, and a long tea, once found, we looked out for each other. We weren't kind. I won't pretend otherwise. No matter what anyone tells you, kindness does not lend itself to survival, but community does. We all needed to survive, so we made ourselves a community. Community is the truest form of light. I hate the dark in all its forms. I fear it. I despise it so much. I made sure darkness could ever enter my own city. I am a being of light. Therefore, I am a being of community. And trust me, you will never find a community quite so tightly knit as a community of lost people who have been forced to find each other. Once found, we worked together. Performance was our work. I loved it. Performance is the one true art that serves everyone in everything. It is also necessary for survival. Every last one of us puts on a performance every moment of every day, unless we are extraordinarily lucky. We accept this about ourselves. We accept that we must perform to belong, but we don't accept this about others. In fact, we punish others for performing every chance we get. For some reason, punishing others for engaging in the very same survival strategy we do bolsters our own sense of superiority. Yet there are people who, through look or luck or lack of learning or sheer exhaustion or outright rebellion, simply cannot perform to the standard society requires. There are other people who refuse entirely. There are more, many more, who perform admirably every minute of their lives until their mask cracks for reasons beyond their control, revealing them for what they truly are. In my experience, what they truly are is every bit as beautiful and worthy as their performance. Unfortunately, society has a tendency to see things differently, and we all must exist within society. Ironically, the people who cannot, or can no longer, or simply do not want to perform in the day-to-day are the best performers the stage, and screen, for that matter, will ever see. My troupe, who I loved, was no exception. My troupe taught me many things. The most important is that talent makes or breaks a troupe. The talent of the unit is as vital as the talent of the individual. The second most important thing is that the most extraordinarily talented people are often the ones no one looks at twice. I loved unearthing talents to look at twice. I suppose you would describe me as a scout. I checked the streets and the eerie alleys, the churches and the orphanages, the whorehouses and the pastures, for people who were as talented as they were lost. I specialized in people who had been abandoned, not for any dangerous or self-serving reason, but because the abandoned are the most lost. I know this because I was abandoned long, long ago. When I want to be, I'm very charismatic. Whether I want to be or not, I'm highly domineering. No matter what, I am the strongest thing I know. This made me an exceedingly successful scout. So successful, in fact, that in combination with my soft spot for the lost and abandoned, my troop soon had too many people to utilize. Infighting began, and it was wholly dramatic. Wholly. As I told you, kindness does not lend itself to survival. With too many people and too few parts to play, kindness ceased to exist. To quell the conflict, I decided to write extra plays, enough for each and every person to have a starring role. I thought it made sense. More plays, more performances, more money. The man who ran the theater troupe did not agree. He claimed it was too much to memorize, too many sets to build, too much work. This was entirely unfair, given that I did most of the work while he collected most of the money. He did not agree with my perspective and insisted on firing half the troupe. I took the fired half and made my own new, better troupe. And of course, I continued my scouting activities. One day, I found a green-eyed child with the most hideous patchy hair. I could see the bugs crawling on her scalp as clearly as the bruises modeling her skin. She was absolutely frightful in every way, but she was the truest talent I have ever seen. The only thing standing between us was the woman who put those bruises on her skin in the first place. I got rid of her and brought the child into my community, into my light. Her talent soon outshone even my expectations, so I immediately wrote a play specially for her. The rest of the troupe was so very angry right up until she began to perform. When they saw her in action, every last one of them fell into awed silence. I knew then that I had struck gold. So special was she that I adopted her. She became my first child. Now, to be fair, the theater is no place to raise a child. None whatsoever, at least not back then. The business was cutthroat, the streets dangerous, the venues themselves dilapidated fire traps. We performed for the working classes when we could, and were lucky to complete a performance before the church or the authorities drove us off. Mostly we performed in the, but there were new lost children everywhere. Some were orphans, some victims, some abandoned, some maimed, some mad, all of them alone, and all of them lost. I found them, I took them in, and I taught them to build and break down sets, to paint the scenery and stitch disparate pieces into costumes in ways easy to undo, to sing and dance and act. But I didn't teach them to write. Children are terrible writers, particularly of plays. I wrote the plays, and they did the rest. We put on shows, picked the pockets of our patrons, and prowled the crowds to steal from bystanders. We had no choice. I had to do something to supplement our income from the theater. After all, I had so many mouths to feed. So many children came to me. You cannot imagine. Most of them were not talented, but that wasn't their fault, so I kept them. However, a very few among them were exceptionally talented. They were also the most lost, the most broken, and in their various ways, the most loving. I adopted them too. In all, I had 6 children that I called my own. The best of them was still the frightful little green-eyed girl, who I despised almost as much as I loved. But that was all right. The rest didn't have to be the best. As with everything, theater falls apart if you only make room for the best. You need great, and you need good, and you need passable, and you need bad, just as much as you need best. I had all of these in my troop. They made my life a nightmare, but a worthwhile and enjoyable one. I liked all of the children. I protected them. I fed them, and I disciplined them, sometimes harshly, sometimes overly harshly. I wasn't always wonderful, but I was always there. That was more than most of them had ever had. I admit I let it go to my head. I have always let things go to my head. It's easy to do when you are the strongest and most powerful thing any place you go. Now, I wanted to spoil my children. The best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad all together. They had all suffered so much, sometimes by my own hand, and still worked so hard. They deserved a reward. They deserved to have what they wanted, and what they all wanted was a home. So I rewarded them with a tiny city of their very own. I built it myself in a little cove by the river. I began with humble intentions, something akin to a playhouse, only marginally better than the sets I designed for our performances. But then I caught my frightful green-eyed daughter studying me as I worked, asking to help, wanting to learn from me. My extraordinary child being as extraordinary as ever, and I knew that she needed something every bit as extraordinary as she. I was taught long ago that love dims what I can do. It weakens everything I am. It renders me almost powerless. Nothing I had seen or experienced made me believe differently, until the night my daughter helped me build our home. For the first time in all time, love made me stronger, and so, for the first time in all time, I was able to make magic for what I loved. The other children, the best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad, all helped. Together, we built our home, an astonishingly perfect tiny city, made beautiful by own prodigious skill, and made even lovelier by the myriad shortcomings of its child artisans. They stole candles and lanterns to light each corner of our little city. Too many candles, too many lanterns, too much light. How it glowed in the night, so beautiful and bright. All the children loved our little city. My favorite daughter, who I did not like, loved it so much she wrote a song for it. Children are not any better at writing songs than they are at writing plays. But she surprised me. I shouldn't have been surprised. She was so extraordinary, after all. And so was her song. A low, haunting little melody, just a shade too melancholy to be a lullaby. She called it "To the City Bright." I told her well done, but not before. I gave her suggestions for improvements. Artists must always strive for improvement. I would have failed in my duties as a father had I not imparted this to her. Even though we had a home, they were still hungry. In the aftermath of the plague, there was so much less than there had been before. Fewer patrons, smaller audiences, little to no money. I did not need food. Our performances sustained me, but they did not sustain my children, who grew more desperate by the day. Children, hungry children especially, hungry broken children most especially, are even less kind than adults, and far less capable of understanding that community is the key to survival. They were at each other's throats every second of every day. It was maddening, but it was entertaining too, and it was inspiring. So inspired that I wrote a play based on their ridiculousness. I had never had so much fun writing anything. I wasn't entirely sure who would want to watch this play, but I was excited to write it, and my own excitement mattered more. Once destroyed, I noticed my play in the wreckage, the one that was so mean it made my children cry, and so funny they laughed so long and so hard that they cried again. Just looking at it was enough to conjure them in my mind's eye. I settled down among the ruins of my city and began to read my play. For a little while, I could almost believe my children were back with me. I could see them. The words evoked them so perfectly, all their little mannerisms and speech patterns, all their silly movements and idiosyncrasies and endless whining. I never thought I would grieve the loss of a child's whine, but I grieved for it that night with my whole heart. When I finished reading the play, I went back to the beginning to start again. This time I read the lines aloud in my children's voices, not just mimicking them, but transforming myself into them, bringing them all back to me for a little while. Whenever I paused to turn the page, I'd laugh or sometimes cry. For many days, I lay among the ruins of our bright little city and read and reread the play until I had it memorized. But with each reading, my evocation grew weaker, as though the memories were a well that was drying up. It was too much to bear. So, one night, I set the play aside in a safe place, precious thing that it was, and I performed it from memory, all by myself, there among the ruins of our little bright city. And in the middle of the first act, my favorite daughter crawled out of the wreckage and began to say her lines. The rest came after her, shimmering into being in darkness that had once been so bright. They paid no attention to me. They only recited their lines. I tried to touch them, but my hands went right through them. I screamed at them. I laughed. I threw things. I tried to shove them. I ran right through them. No matter what I did, they did not see me. They weren't real. Or maybe I wasn't real. Maybe none of were. Whatever the truth, we were apart. Even though they looked as real as anything has ever been, they were beyond my reach. All I could do was watch them. So I did. Night after night, I summoned my children to watch them perform. On the seventh night, I had a dream. I don't remember the dream. I never remember my dreams. I hope I never will. But I woke up with a purpose. Why would my children stay after their performance? They had nowhere to be, no home to stay in. I had destroyed it. So I rebuilt the city, piece by piece, exactly as I remembered, right down to the myriad imperfections of my child artisans. When it was done, I stole candles and lanterns and lit every corner of it until the structure blazed with light, blinding gold against the night. Then I strode into the very center and began to read our play. Before the opening monologue was complete, they crawled and trundled from the 6 doorways surrounding and began to perform. This time, I could touch them, but they still didn't notice me. They recited their lines, even when I touched their hair, tugged their costumes, knocked them down, or dragged them off stage. Nothing I did stopped or even interrupted their impeccable line delivery. When the performance concluded, they linked hands and bowed. Then they split into 6 little lines, each of which exited through a different little door. This had never happened before. At the conclusion of the play, they simply glimmered out of being the way they glimmered into it. Like the stars at dawn, my little green-eyed monstrosity exited last. I crawled after her, yelling her name. She paid no attention as she vanished through the door She kicked it shut, but I caught it just before it latched and threw it open. Before me was a vast, shining darkness, a glimmering void begging for light. I tried to go inside, but it was like pressing against a glass wall. I called my daughter's name. I called all of their names. Nothing answered but an echo of my own desperate voice. Once I'd screamed myself hoarse. To no result, I checked the other doors. They opened onto the little enclosed city streets just as they were supposed to. No voids, no darkness, only bright, beautiful streets, sized for broken, extraordinary children. The next day, I read my cursed play again, just like before. The children entered through the 6 little doors and commenced their performance. At the end, I followed my youngest son, the one who died first, to the 2nd door. I caught it an instant before it latched and tried to go in. Once again, it was as though I was up against an invisible, impenetrable wall. Through the doorway, I saw full, black darkness without even a shimmer. Only emptiness. The worst, most monstrous kind of emptiness. The idea of my children being trapped there drove me to a frenzy. I hurled myself against the invisible wall, desperate to go after them, to find them, to bring them back home into the light. I couldn't. The next day, I followed my 3rd child through the 3rd door, catching it an instant before. As I looked up and saw the 3rd doorway spilling its meager square of light into that living, terrible dark, I knew the star was trying to reach it, that it would try to squeeze through, to break in and devour the light of my little city and all the light that lay beyond. I crawled up, screaming as my scorched and blistered skin sloughed off, and reached the little door. I climbed through and slammed it shut. Just as the darkness began to bleed through, I fear darkness. I hate it. I always have. That is why I made the city bright. I did not want my children to live in the dark. On the 4th night, I went to the 4th door. Beyond it was the darkest water I have ever seen. Within it flickered a behemoth, like a shark made of nightmares and rot, with a shimmering, hypnotic pattern of dimmest light dancing across its awful skin. I tried to follow, because at least there was a hint of light, but I couldn't. No matter what I did, I couldn't. Not through any of them. The next night, I tried the 5th door. The night after that, the 6th. I won't tell you what lay behind them. It is too terrible even for me to relate to you. 6 doors, 6 paths, each of them closed to me. My children lay beyond them, trapped in eternal hungry darkness, and me too weak to follow. I was a father too useless to protect the only things I had ever promised to protect. On the night I tried the 6th door, I had another dream that I do not remember, and once again, I woke with a purpose. That very morning, I went around the city advertising the performance of a lifetime. Hyperbole, yes, but I was desperate, and the crowds were gullible, small, but eminently gullible. It was easy to lure them to my show. They watched the performance with bright, shining eyes and awestruck smiles. When my children gave their final bow and crawled off stage, I made the audience follow my green-eyed little horror through her door. It was easy. The audience wanted to follow her. After all, she was the best performer. Everyone wants proximity to the best. None of the audience hit an invisible wall. Perhaps that is the privilege of humanness. I wouldn't know, and I no longer care. Moments after the last spectator vanished into the darkness, a pair of dear, familiar little hands shot out of the dark and gripped the doorway. I grabbed them and pulled. My green-eyed daughter emerged, scared and skinny, and so very extraordinary. Her less extraordinary siblings, who had followed her through the door, came after her. The great, the good, the passable, and the bad. I welcomed them all, laughing and crying. Once they were all out, I held my green-eyed daughter all night, weeping joyfully as she hurled insults, told me to shut up so she could sleep. The next day, we all went out into the city to advertise a wonderful and wondrous one-of-a-kind show. Once again, the audience came, small but gullible. Once again, they watched the performance with awe and happily followed the performers through the little door into the vast, hungry dark. Once again, after the last scream faded, a set of dear little hands slapped the door frame. Once again, I hauled my child out of the dark and into the light. Once again, his lesser brothers and sisters followed. The next day, we all went into the streets to advertise a performance such as the world had never seen. It was an exaggeration, of course, but exaggeration is the essence of entertainment. Once again, the audience came, less small this time, but just as gullible. This is how I rescued my dead children and their brothers and sisters, by feeding the hungry dark so much it had no choice but to vomit them back into the light. The crowds swelled. So did our earnings. So did my troop. Soon, I had all my children back. We were happy. We were family. We were a troop. I loved them. My love for them anchored me. It trapped me. It made me weak. I hate being weak. All monsters despise weakness. I am no different. But I thought my weakness would save them until I was no longer exiled from my city bright, until I could bring them there with me. My weakness did not save anything, especially not them. Over the years, they all died again, some of illness, some of accidents, some of stupidity, some of hatred, some of pain. Alone of them, my green-eyed daughter, who I almost hated, died of old age. "Bring me back again, Papa," she told me with her last breath. "Like you did before. Please." I tried. I tried even harder to bring her back than I tried with the others. But no matter how many plays I wrote or read or memorized or performed, no matter what I built or destroyed or rebuilt, no matter what I tried or what I did or who I tore apart or who I sacrificed, nothing brought them back, not even her. My love destroyed me for a very long time. When I finally rebuilt myself, I went back and reclaimed my city bright, not for my benefit, but for my children. I hate the dark. I despise it. I fear it. That's all my frightful daughter wanted, for her papa to bring her back. I couldn't do that for her. Wherever she is now, I know she's very angry at me for denying her. Sometimes I feel her kicking me. I have already promised myself that I will never give you cause to kick me. If you're new here, this is going to make no sense. It might not even make sense if you're not new. Either way, I'm sorry. The second those words left the harlequin's mouth, he lunged across the table and dragged me under. Everything was utterly wrong. The floor beneath was somehow stretched to an impossibly far horizon. The table itself looked like it was 100 feet overhead. Dust clusters, the size of small cars, loomed in the distance. It was far too big, far too cold, and far too bright. The harlequin's hand crushed my shoulder as he dragged me forward. His body was doing something sinuous and hideous, a powerful, boneless movement that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. At the very end of the floor, how was it so far away, was a band of blinding, brilliant light. Even from a distance, it was so painful, I squeezed my eyes shut. He dragged me right up to the edge. For an awful second, I was sure he was going to throw me in. "Look," he said. I couldn't. Even with my eyes closed, it was so bright I was viscerally terrified. It would burn my eyes out. "Look," he tried to force my eyes open. Long, thick fingers pinching my eyelids. "I can't," I screamed. "You have to look. It's the only way to see which mind you're in." All my other children looked. He said, "Why won't you, darling girl?" "Because I'm not your darling girl," I kicked away. He let me. Keeping my eyes shut, I spun around and crawled in the opposite direction. I thought it would take forever, but before I knew it, someone was pulling me to my feet and shoving me as far away as the room allowed. Christoph, of course. Who else would it be? The harlequin was still under the desk, watching me. His face had changed. It was recognizable, and almost his, but terribly, stomach-churningly wrong. "I give all my children what they want," he said. "Nothing more and nothing less. That is all I am trying to do for you. You've made me very angry. So angry, I don't even want to be your father anymore. But family needs each other, even when they don't want to be family. I need you, and you need me, even more. Remember that when I come back, darling girl." With a smile that made me want to scream, he slithered around and vanished into the darkness beneath. The weirdest thing, not the scariest, but the weirdest, is that he apparently slithered through his little wormhole right back into his own cell, as if this wasn't enough stress for one day. I have a meeting with the agency director in less than an hour. He says he's going to show me another one of my creepy employee files. It's safe to say I'm not looking forward to it. Not a bit. 3 scratches mean you're dead, and I've just found the first scratch on my door. I live in a small town in Vermont. I won't tell you its name, mostly because I don't want to draw any attention to myself. I moved here 6 months ago to take over this record store that's been a town fixture for yonks. The previous owner, Martin Kelly, was desperate to leave, practically gave the place away. His hands shook so bad he could barely sign the papers, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone or something to be standing there. Should have been my first clue, but when you've been living out of your car, scraping by on part-time work at gas stations and dollar stores, landing a deal like this feels like winning the lottery. The store barely breaks even, but it came with a small apartment above the store, a kind of attic flat with a little kitchenette, and a serviceable bathroom. The pipes groan at night, and the floorboards bitch every time you take a step. But it's warm, safe, and has an awesome view over the rooftops. At first, it felt like I'd stumbled into some perfect slice of small-town Americana, the kind they put on postcards or in those Hallmark movies my mom used to watch. Victorian homes, built from locally quarried stone, line the winding cobblestone streets. Neighbors wave, but don't pry. Weekly farmers markets in the town square, where old ladies sell jam in mason jars with handwritten labels. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, but pretends they don't. My first morning here, I was in the shop rearranging the store's inventory when Sheriff Tapper poked his head in. He's an older man with cheeks that never quite recovered from acne in his youth, a slight paunch, and a too calm voice that always leaves you wondering if he's hiding something. He offered to show me around the record store, basically just pointing out the dusty corners and the old fuse box. But before he left, he fixed me with a serious look. "Listen," he said, tapping a calloused finger on the old wooden countertop. "Since you're new here, there might come a time you notice some weird shit scratched into your door. If you see anything like that, you come to me right away. Day of, no excuses." He tried to keep it casual, but his eyes gave him away. "Probably won't happen to you," he added quickly, "but if it does, we like to handle it fast. You absolutely have to tell us. Got it?" I remember staring at him, a half smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Sure, it was some kind of joke. Sure. But why? Who's doing it? Tapper just waved a meaty hand, dismissing the question like smoke. "Wouldn't want to scare you off on your first day," he said, and walked out, letting the shop's brass bell announce his exit. I chalked it up to small-town eccentricities. Maybe some local pranksters who like to scratch up doors. But early the next morning, I noticed the sheriff walking the length of Main Street, shining his flashlight on every door, examining them one by one. He did it methodically, like a doctor checking stitches, looking for something very specific. When he caught me watching from my second-floor window, he gave me a curt nod and moved on. He does this every morning, every single one, without fail. Rain, shine, or New England blizzard. A couple of months later, I was up before dawn, flipping through dusty vinyl records, when I heard a low, rhythmic stomping, peering through the concert posters plastered on the shop's front windows. Kurt Cobain's dead eyes staring back at me. I saw them marching by, mothers in thick wool coats, their faces set like stone, men clutching garden tools and kitchen knives that gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light. Old Mr. Harrison from the hardware store had his Winchester cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. I followed them. I don't know why. Maybe the same morbid curiosity that makes you slow down past a car wreck. They converged on a small blue house near the town square, the kind with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. The woman they dragged out was still in her nightgown, her feet bare against the cold cobblestones. She didn't fight back. She just kept shaking her head, tears cutting clean tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks, begging them to give her more time. And, "Don't you see this is all bullshit?" Eventually, her words dissolved into raw screams about how they were all crazy, her fists beating away at anyone who tried to approach. The crowd's response was a wall of sound, accusations about overstaying, warnings about putting us all at risk, demands that she honor the arrangement. I thought about calling the cops, but there were in the crowd too, local badges shining in the golden dawn, uniforms crinkled and unironed like they'd hurried to put them on. 20 minutes later, someone pulled up in a pickup truck, already loaded with boxes and suitcases, like they'd packed her belongings before even getting her out of bed. They pretty much dragged her kicking and screaming into the passenger seat, and the truck disappeared down the mountain road that leads out of town. After that, the mob dissolved, and that whole day, I didn't hear another word about it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment above the shop, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in these old windows, and tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Small towns can be insular, I told myself. Maybe she'd done something to deserve it. The next morning, I took a walk past the blue house. Front door still wide open, yesterday's newspaper sitting untouched on the front lawn. That was when I noticed the marks on her door. 2 of them, shaped like crooked eyes, scratched deep into the wood. They looked kind of fresh, the wood around it still pale and raw, like exposed bone. I took a picture and reverse image searched the symbol, but came up empty, just page after page of actual eyes staring back at me till I had to close the browser. Figured maybe it was unrelated. Told myself that coincidences happen all the time. Life settled into a rhythm after that first morning. I threw myself into running the store, learning the regulars' tastes, ordering rare pressings they'd mention offhandedly. One customer in particular, Cal, would spend hours browsing the jazz section, talking about Miles Davis and John Coltrane like they were old friends. "You've got good instincts," he told me one afternoon, carefully sliding a Thelonious Monk album backward. 2 months passed. I was getting comfortable and starting to feel like I belonged. For the first time in as many years, I was earning a weekly wage, went to bed full each night, have money left over to furnish my loft just how I liked it. It was odd, almost novel, having a place I could call home, except for that one morning with the woman in the blue house and Sheriff Tapper walking past each morning to inspect doorways. This place was nothing short of heaven to me. Then one morning, the parade of footsteps returned. This time they came for old Abel Thompson, who'd run the bakery for 40 years. Everyone knew Abel. He donated day-old bread to the food bank and remembered every kid's birthday with a free muffin. The scene was different this time. Abel hugged each person in the crowd, tears in his eyes, but a gentle smile on his face. "It's time," he kept saying. "I'm just surprised it took him this long." The mob was somber, some people openly weeping as they helped him pack his truck. I checked out his door the next day, and just like the blue house, there was a symbol etched into the wood, just one this time, staring out like a cyclopean eye. I asked around about these symbols. Some folks brushed me off. Others gave evasive answers. But one thing was consistent. If your door got marked, then you had to leave town immediately. It was said to keep everyone else safe. There was talk of consequences, of some looming danger no one wanted to describe, like a shadow you catch in your peripheral vision, but disappears when you turn to look at it. It became clear the sheriff's morning inspection was his way of catching these scratchings early. He'd warn the inhabitants to leave. Sometimes they went peacefully, like old Abel Thompson. Sometimes, when the marked was a newer person in town, they put up a fight. No one ever explained who or what made the marks. The best I could piece together was that after 3 markings, something bad happened. Last night, I was doing the final count of the register when rapid footsteps approached the shop. I glanced up, ready to wave away another late customer. when someone started pounding on the door with such urgency that the bell above it jangled. Through the concert posters, I could see Cal's familiar silhouette, but something was wrong. His normally relaxed posture was rigid, and he kept shifting from foot to foot like he was standing on burning coals. I opened the door. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the autumn chill. "Listen carefully," he said, the words tumbling out so fast they blurred together like cars in a highway pileup. One hand gripped my shoulder with crushing force. "No matter what happens tonight, stay inside. Keep the lights off, TV off, absolute silence. Lock everything." His eyes darted to the lengthening shadows that crept across the cobblestones. "If someone knocks, if they ask to be let in, don't move. Don't make eye contact through the windows. And whatever you do, do not respond." "Cal, what's going on?" "The Peterson family," he explained hurriedly, his breath coming in short gasps, like he'd been running. 3 markings. They covered it up with paint. Didn't want to leave. Left us wide open. His grip tightened painfully, then released. "I can't say more. Rules. I need to get home before dark." He checked his watch, and his face, impossibly, went even paler, like all the blood had been drained out. Oh God, I might already be too late." He sprinted away before I could stop him, his footsteps echoing off the old buildings. I stood there with the key half turned in the lock, watching him disappear around the corner. I followed his instructions, though I felt ridiculous doing it, like a kid hiding under the covers from the boogeyman. But something in his voice, that raw animal fear, had sent ice water through my veins. I'd never seen someone so genuinely terrified, not even that first woman they'd driven out of town. The evening crept by in suffocating silence. I sat in my darkened apartment, watching the streetlights flicker to life outside. Every creak of the old building settling made my heart skip. I kept checking my phone, considering calling Cal, but his warning about absolute silence held me back. The first knock came at 12:07 a.m. I know, because I'd been obsessively checking the time. It was soft, tentative, like someone testing if the sound would carry. 3 gentle taps, evenly spaced, coming from the shop's front door downstairs. I held my breath, Cal's warning echoing in my mind. For a long moment, nothing. Then it came again, harder this time, a rhythm of desperate needs. And then, "Hello?" The voice sliced through the darkness, and my blood ran cold. It was Cal's voice, edged with the same fear, but quiet, like he was trying not to get caught. "Please, I didn't make it home in time. I've been stuck out here in the dark for hours." I laid there, heart beating in my chest. Then I told myself I was bae. "Please," the voice cracked, hitching on a sob that sounded like it was being torn from deep inside. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here, so dark." The smart thing would have been to stay silent, but I had to know. "If it's really you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "tell me your favorite record in the store." The silence that followed dragged on and on. Then came the response, in a voice that was both Cal's and not Cal's. I don't know." Ice crawled up my spine like 1,000 tiny spiders. "Leave," I managed to choke out. Now, a pause, Then something outside laughed. "Didn't he tell you?" it whispered, and I heard, rather than saw, a long fingernail trace its way down my door frame. Not to respond to anyone who came knocking, I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the first stair. The shadow behind the glass seemed to grow, spreading like a stain, darker than the darkness around it. I took the stairs two at a time, slamming and locking my apartment door behind me. I dragged my heavy oak dresser in front of it, then huddled in the corner of my bedroom, as far from any windows as I could get. The knocking continued sporadically through the night, moving from window to window, accompanied by Cal's voice trying different tactics, pleading, demanding, bargaining. Around 3 a.m., it started cycling through other voices I knew. Abel, the woman from my first week. Then a voice that sounded oddly like my own. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to seep through my fingers, straight into my brain. Sleep was impossible. I watched the clock tick through the endless hours. Finally, dawn broke to the sound of screaming. This time, the mob moved with purpose, but their usual grim determination had been replaced by fear. Sheriff Mills was already at the scene, his face the color of chalk as he waved people back. The mob had led me to a house 2 blocks away from my own, the Petersons' place. I recognized it because they'd painted their door recently, a cheery yellow that had seemed out of place in our somber little town. The door was hanging off its hinges now, splinters of wood scattered across the welcome mat like broken teeth. Blood was everywhere, pooling on the welcome mat where home sweet home was now just home sue me, trailing into the darkness beyond the broken door, like breadcrumbs leading into a witch's forest. A police constable was scraping at something on the door. Fresh paint, still wet, hastily applied over familiar eye-shaped symbols. There were 3 of them. Must have been covering them up each morning. I overheard Tapper whisper gravely, "They didn't have the best life. Reckon they had nowhere to go." "Whole family," someone else whispered, drowning out his words. "Tried to cover up the scratchings. You can't hide from them. They always know." I found Cal in the crowd, his face gray as week-old snow. "This wouldn't have happened if they'd just told the truth," he said, shaking his head. "If they'd just followed the rules." "Why?" I asked, desperate. "What is this?" "I can't say." He attempted a reassuring smile that looked more like a grimace. "But you should be safe, so long as you follow the rules." His expression shifted, became sharper, more focused. "You didn't hear anything last night, did you? Open the door? Talk to anyone?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, nothing." The lie tasted like copper on my tongue. The bodies were wheeled out in black bags as the sun climbed higher. Back home, I checked the front door to the vinyl shop compulsively. No markings. I exhaled slowly, relief flooding through me. Maybe I could make this work. Sure, the town had its dark secret, but didn't they all? Some towns had corrupt mayors, others had toxic waste dumps. Ours just had whatever this was, and hadn't they taken me in when I had nothing? Given me a home, a purpose, a place to belong? As long as you followed the rules, you could survive. People here did it every day. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, rehearsing all the reasons to stay, all the justifications for looking the other way. The mental gymnastics we do to convince ourselves that the monster under our bed is just a shadow, that the scratching at our window is just a tree branch. Then I saw it, there, carved into my attic door, a single eye-shaped symbol, the wood around it still fresh and pale. This isn't a door Sheriff Tapper can check. This is a door nobody should have had access to. So now I'm writing this, sitting cross-legged on my bed with my laptop balanced on my knees. I don't have any family left to miss me, and all the friends I've made are from here. They'd be more likely to show up with pitchforks than helping hands if they knew. I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me thinks it's just town theater, or some madman with a twisted sense of humor. Part of me wonders if it isn't all just superstition turned hysteria. People fulfilling their... I bought my dad an infrared scope, and we saw something horrible in the woods with it. My dad has always been a hunter. Even now, at his ripe old age of 56, he still tries to get out, lay traps, hunt squirrels, and even takes in other hunters' kills and butchers them, most of the time for a payment of only meat. He doesn't do much deer or bear hunting anymore. But on a good day, you'll catch him in the woods on his side-by-side, looking up in the trees for a squirrel, or chasing a raccoon out of its hole. Selling the meat or hide hardly grants any money for the time it takes to hunt, kill, prepare, and ultimately cure the hide. But my dad still does it. I think it's because he's done it all his life, and it has slowly become a routine, a ritual, a need. If he's not occupying his time, then he's doing nothing. And in his mind, doing nothing is how you die. These days, my dad isn't very fit. He's older, he's weaker, and he damn near can't walk anymore. But you will still catch him out in the woods, rifle in his hand, knife on his belt, and a fresh kill or two in the back of his side-by-side. Although, I think that is subject to change now. Everything is going to change now. A few days after Christmas and into the new year, we received a package from UPS. I was surprised it was even delivered because there was over 8 inches of snow on the ground. The snow wouldn't stop for another 2 days after this either. I checked my Amazon account and found that, yes, it indeed was meant to be delivered that day. I just didn't receive the notification. It was good news anyway. The Christmas present I ordered for my dad had finally arrived. A week and some change after Christmas, I was excited to present it to him, as he had never owned one in his life. An infrared scope, night vision. I opened it, made sure it worked really quick in my room, put it back in its packaging, and presented it to my dad. "Shit, son, this is amazing. You want to go outside and test it?" He was beaming. My gift was definitely better than the $2 watch my brother had gotten my dad. "Yes, sir. I'll slip my boots on real quick. Frankie, you come too." My brother, Frankie, began pulling on his full snow gear. I, who run hot as a furnace most of the time, just slipped on a jacket and my boots. My dad did the same. We opened the main door, then the screen door leading to our back porch, which bordered the woods almost directly. The screen door creaked, then slammed shut as the springs kicked it into overdrive. In single file, we marched down the steps, my dad holding on to the infrared scope, with the delicacy of holding a chicken egg. He put it up to his eyeball, lifting his glasses up as he did so, and toggled the infrared function on them. He bellowed out in laughter, "I'll be a son of a bitch. This is incredible, son." He scanned the tree line, over and over. He noted a squirrel in one of the trees closest to him. A bird, finch of some kind, he said, in a bush a little further away. And then he stopped dead, frozen momentarily. What the fuck is that? What is it, Dad? Frankie spoke up, nearly shouting. Quiet, quiet. Dad had started speaking in a whisper and hunkered down. We both did the same. Dad, I whispered back at him nearly a minute later. He was still staring off into the edge of the forest. Let me see, reluctant to take his eye off whatever had caught his attention. But knowing I had the second most experience in the woods among us, and knowing that if anyone were to identify an unknown animal, it would probably be me, he handed me the infrared scope. Looking through it was awesome. Everything was immediately bright, and I could make out probably 100, maybe even 200 or more feet into the woods. It wasn't exactly in true focus. As focused as I could get was probably, to put it in a term most of you can understand, 480p quality. Like a video shot on an older camera, I scanned the tree line, looking for whatever my dad saw, but seeing nothing. Then, movement, something shaking in the woods, at the very edge of focus on the infrared scope. It's eating. I found myself whispering this to my dad. A deer, I know. But what is it? Frankie, go get Dad's rifle. Now, let me... I cut him off with a wave of my hand. He's only 11 and has never been good at whispering. Now, Frankie, the 45-70, not the 30-30. Load it, cock it, and bring it. Quietly, Frankie got up and moved into the house. Without another word, he was smart enough to not let the door creak and slam, like we so carelessly did coming out there. I have no idea what the hell that is, Dad. The thing in the woods was covered in blood. The thick fur on its neck and shoulders were clearly matted, wet with the blood of the deer. I dared to move closer. 5 feet, 10, then 15. The image getting clearer and clearer as I went. 30 feet closer, and I could, the unnatural, bend in the thing's knees. I could see the 3 long claws digging in, right at me, baring its crooked, sharp teeth. I held a scream and cocked the rifle, successfully putting a round in the chamber. The thing was barreling toward me. Running at speeds I have never seen anything that big move. It leaped and bound its way effortlessly through the woods, directly at me. It, too, had infrared. There was, and still is, no doubt in my mind. It could see me, and I could see it. The wolf thing's eyes opened wide, and so did its mouth. They were, in fact, empty, completely. I suppose you don't need pupils when you see an infrared, sensors or something, I guess, inside those black, lifeless sockets. It sprang from the ground, a great leap, from nearly 20 feet away, heading right toward me. I pulled the trigger, and a deafening boom rang my ears. If any of you have fired such a weapon, you know how loud they are. Deafening is an understatement, as I could hear a very high-pitched ringing, and nothing else. The thud from the gun on my shoulder knocked my face, more importantly my eye, away from the infrared scope. I quickly cocked the gun, placed my face against the scope, and looked through the infrared again. It was gone. I hit it, maybe only nicked it, but it was gone. In the snow, I could see tracks leading away, and a few drops of blood following them. God, I hope I killed it, and I hope it was the only one. My dad has been up every night since, in his rocking chair, 4570 in his lap, infrared scope in hand, looking out the back window and eyeing the tree line. I don't think he or I will be going into the woods ever again. I traveled back to the Cretaceous and haven't been the same. Since I know that sounds insane, but there isn't another way to phrase it. I went on a study trip a month ago with a group of students and professors to Utah. The reason I say study trip is because that is what everyone else thinks. But we didn't just go to collect fossils. We went to collect live material. If I had known what would happen, I wouldn't have gone in the first place. I should have said no. I should have taken a thesis opportunity in Wyoming, North Dakota, or Australia. But instead, I traveled back to the Cretaceous and haven't been the same since. It started when my professor, Dr. Jameson, reached out to me. It was an email about a thesis opportunity. She remembered a recent conversation we had about the evolution of angiosperms and decline of gymnosperms in the late Cretaceous. I agreed to continue the conversation in person, only because she insisted on it, said that email wasn't safe. When I met with her, I didn't believe her. I sat there as she told me what a group of physicists were able to do down in Utah, and that we had gained permission to do it as well. The longer I sat there, the more serious she got. She had a few sheets of paper from an NDA she had signed. She said it was proof, and just because I wanted to get my PhD, I went along with it. A month later, we flew from Portland to Salt Lake, and then to the Cretaceous. The day we left, we started at 4 a.m. On the drive to the university, I had déjà vu. My head was resting up against the window, and my whole skull vibrated like it did whenever I rode the bus as a kid. Dr. Jameson sat beside me, her back as straight and unmoving as usual. We finally pulled into a near-empty parking lot, illuminated by sporadic, flickering sodium lights. I looked over to Dr. Jameson, who didn't return the courtesy. The driver of the car put it in park. I peered out the window again. A group of cars were parked in the cone of orange light before us. Dr. Jameson unbuckled her seatbelt and let it slither back up into the holster. I followed suit and caught up to her as she marched up the sidewalk to the side of a large brick building. A glass door stood propped open by a brick. We both soon found ourselves in a small lecture hall lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. I stopped at the door as she continued further. It seemed that Dr. Jameson and I weren't the only pair of professors and students. I recognized the logos of some of the hoodies other students were wearing. A university in Utah, one in Texas, another in Santa Cruz. I noted the last one in particular. They have an arboretum dedicated to plants in the Protea family. Everyone else was dressed in nondescript clothing. A group of 9 people total, including us. Everyone's eyes naturally turned to us, the same way a full class would when you walked through the door of a lecture hall. I felt my face grow hot as a response. I was never good at meeting new people. Dr. Jameson didn't waste time marching over to some other professors and introducing herself. I stood in the doorframe, flexing my hands by my sides. Before I could do anything, one of the people dressed in non-university clothing stepped up to me and held out his hand. I frantically wiped my hand on my side before shaking his. It was an obnoxiously firm handshake. "I'm Ben. What's your name?" I swallowed as he kept pumping my hand. Without another word, She steered me towards the professors and away from everyone else. I didn't think it was possible, but my hands got even clammier. Graham, this is Doctors Chilton, Myers, and Potter. She motioned to the three people before us. They each shook my hand in turn. Doctors, this is my mentee, Graham. He's especially interested in the evolutionary lineage of vascular plants and one of my brightest students. Ask him anything about evolutionary taxonomy and you won't be able to shut him up. They each nodded and said different variances of, "Ooh, that's very nice." I immediately got the feeling of inferiority, much like a child that brought up a scribbled drawing to a distant relative. "Ooh, how nice. Very good." I was shackled to the conversation for a few more minutes before I found a comfortable outing, much to my satisfaction. I hastily walked with my hands plastered to my sides back to Ben. I think I can say now that I preferred his company over a bunch of middle-aged doctors of geology, astrophysics, and paleontology. Ben was talking to the other three students. No, candidates there. I stopped by his side and fussed over the front of my shirt. Compared to the three before me, I must have missed the memo. I was the only candidate without a school hoodie or sweater. Graham, we were just talking about you. Ben put his arm behind me and pushed me forward a bit. My stomach decided to play musical chairs with my heart. Really? Yeah. We're trying to find out what school you're from, one of the other candidates said. For ease, I'll just call them by their university places. Utah was a blonde woman with loose curls. Texas was a tall, dark man with a terrifying grip. And Cruz didn't blink once. Like, at all. I'm from Oregon. Go Ducks. I pumped a pathetic fist in the air while everyone stared at me. I was suddenly filled with the urge to fling myself off the nearest building. We talked for a while, and I gleaned that Cruz was another paleontology candidate, while Utah and Texas were astrophysics and geology, respectively. It was another few minutes before the two circles became a massive huddle. We all turned to listen, to them speak. Dr. Chilton took the lead. Sit, please, he ordered. We all sat except for Utah, who walked up to stand beside Dr. Chilton. Once I sat in one of the cushioned chairs, I started to bounce my legs. The only thing I was thinking about was, when would we go back? Dr. Jameson sat beside me and eyed my bouncing legs with a disapproving look. I stopped and put my hands underneath my thighs. Utah gathered some folders and handed them out to the rest of us. When I received mine, I took a peek inside. There was my name. My name. Now I'm sure that you all know why you're here. Dr. Chilton leaned back onto the podium behind him. At this university, we have had a breakthrough. Our physics and engineering departments have collaborated on making a machine. You will see it shortly. With this machine, we will have the ability to go back in time. You each are here for a reason. Whether it be collecting botanical material, he motioned to me and Dr. Jameson, or monitoring the stars and progression of the asteroid. Some of you will be paying attention to animal life or collecting rock samples. He began to stress that there was a set of rules that we needed to follow. Rules that must be followed no matter what. These were the rules. We can't remove our suits, just like an astronaut. Removal of suits means that there could be cross-contamination of microbes in case of an injury, like a sprained ankle or cut. Everyone must return to the shuttle. All collected material must be kept in the material bags and under quarantine. And if any of our suits are punctured, we must undergo quarantine until we are sure that there is no cross-contamination to the present. I didn't know there was so much dedicated to preventing cross-contamination, but it made sense. After a long lecture about how the machine worked, why would we need to know that? He finally closed the talking with, in each of your folders, you have objectives written by your mentors. That is your goal on this trip. Read as we walk to the next building. In the folder, I read my objectives from Dr. Jameson. The whole thing took up less than half a page. Grom, it is likely that we will not recognize most of the plant species there. We should recognize some families, at least. Since you have shown such an interest in vascular plants, I would like you to collect, if possible, 1 pteridophyte, 1 gymnosperm sample, and 1 angiosperm sample. We are traveling to the late Cretaceous, so there should be some angiosperms visible. If not, just get the closest thing you can. In this situation, anything is gold. Just understand, whatever you pick up is whatever you're going to study for the rest of your career. Choose wisely. I swallowed and braced myself as we walked back outside. It was well into mortal. It was unnerving when I put on the helmet. Everything sounded muted. I looked over at Ben as his helmet got shoved on. This image was immediately blocked out by the bloom of condensation from my breath. One of the nurses, I'll just call them nurses, fumbled with something around my neck, and a bright puff of air shot past my ear and cleared my vision. Another nurse prodded the other side of my neck, and a tiny hiss told me that air was leaving through that side of my face. I looked back at Ben and waved. He waved back. Latches were pulled, and things were tightened for a few minutes, which gave me time to look around inside my helmet. There were tiny screens that blinked to life on either side of my head. Through them, I saw nurses working behind me, like I had my own backup camera. As they fiddled some more, Ben's voice crackled near my ear. Not too shabby, huh? I turned back to him. I think I'm getting claustrophobic, I joked. One of the nurses stopped and looked at me. I shook my head and waved him to continue. I could see behind me, talk to everyone else that had a suit on, and monitor the oxygen level in my suit. What if we need to pee? I asked one of the nurses. There were a few laughs through the comms, and I realized that I asked everyone that question. There will be a bathroom on the shuttle, as well as a way to decontaminate before you go back outside, Dr. Chilton said. We should expect to be there for about an hour, so hopefully you won't waste that time. Use the bathroom for emergencies only. We left the room and shuffled into a sterile-looking hall. Ben asked the question that made us stop. We should have stopped the whole operation there. What if we encounter a velociraptor or a T-Rex? What if something tries to eat us? There was no reply for a moment before Dr. Potter answered the question. It's unlikely that we will encounter a velociraptor, as those lived in Asia. We're going to be where Utah is today, but, well, in the Cretaceous, it will be a swamp. The only thing we need to worry about is not puncturing our suits. We all began walking again. Then what will Cruz be able to observe? Ben asked. Isn't he supposed to look at animal life, or what Dr. Chilton said? Cruz huffed. That's if I can see anything, he muttered. There are more than just dinosaurs, you know. Ancient invertebrates, fish, maybe. He drifted off. Oof, was Ben's reply. Coming from the journalist, I was sure that stung. What are you supposed to do? Cruz asked. Ben raised his hands up and mimed holding a camera. I'm here to document everything. Get pictures of you guys. Take in the details. My usual job. That sounded a lot less stressful than the rest of us. We walked in silence until we came to a large silver door with a rotating wheel in the center. It seemed out of place, like it should be in a submarine. Two of the doctors, Myers and Chilton, I think, rotated the handle and pulled the door open. We walked in single file to a small hallway that opened into another room. Take your seats, one of the doctors instructed. I looked around and saw seats positioned evenly through one side of the room, with two located at the far end. Texas turned, their suit creaking. Is this the shuttle? She asked. There were no windows, just metal walls. There was a hiss of air as the door sealed itself on the other side of the small hallway. No, not a hallway, an antechamber. Yes, Dr. Jameson replied as they hauled shut another door with an identical spinning wheel. I began to hear my heartbeat in my ears. On a far wall, there were what looked like multiple dressers, all away from the seats, and divided by a low metal barrier. I eased myself down into a seat and waited for Dr. Jameson to sit beside me. She didn't. She sat at the front near the wall, where a panel stuck out. When she looked over her shoulder at me, she nodded to the dressers. The one on the far left? That has the equipment you'll need to collect samples. I nodded. The other doctors relayed similar information. The seat I had chosen was farthest away from the dressers, up against the wall. I relaxed into the armrests and felt the cold of the metal. I could imagine that I was an astronaut, ready for liftoff. At the time, I only hoped that this would not be like the Challenger explosion. Cruz sat to my right, and Texas further down. Ben sat directly in front of me, and Utah next to him. They were engaged in conversation over the comms. Something about seatbelts. I looked over my shoulder and saw belts, like on a car seat. We had to be strapped in for the trip. I wasn't sure what I was thinking. Maybe something more spacey, or even like the buckles found on airplanes. I followed suit, sure that they all connected properly into a buckle at the center of my chest. Dr. Myers walked around and checked each of our restraints. Never mind, it felt like a carnival ride. Yeah, a carnival ride. And Dr. Myers was checking to make sure that all of Yupus. We jerked forward and rolled some more, then stopped abruptly. My head flung forward and crashed back into my headrest, cushioned, thankfully. I looked around, expecting it to be over. None of the doctors moved. That was when I heard the cracking sound. It came from the wall to my left. I stopped breathing for a second to listen better. Yeah, a cracking sound. It sounded like glass cracking, on the verge of breaking under some tremendous weight. Then I heard someone moaning on the other side. Please, please stay, were the words I heard, as if they were spoken from the other side of a sliding glass door. The voice was begging, no pleading with someone or something to stay. I peered at the wall, trying to ascertain the exact spot where it came from. Before I could, the vibrating took over again, and we slid. I'm not sure how to explain it. Have you ever been driving when there's ice on the road and hit the brakes? It had the same feeling of movement as sliding over a patch of long, extended ice. The sounds stopped as soon as we slid. The feeling continued for a few more seconds, then stopped entirely. We sat for a moment before relaxing. I turned to Cruz. "Did you hear?" I forked my thumb over at the wall. Cruz looked at me in confusion. "Hear what? Everyone shouting?" "No, never mind. I think my brain got scrambled while we were being tossed around." He shrugged. "I think all of us got scrambled. At least we didn't break anything, right?" I smiled weakly. "At least." The comms crackled, and Dr. Chilton's voice came over. "We're lucky. That was a smooth ride." I exchanged glances with Cruz. "Can we unbuckle now?" Texas asked. "It's hard to breathe." Sure. Dr. Chilton threw up his hands. Up, everyone." We each unbuckled ourselves and shakily walked out of our seats. Utah especially looked a little green. "How do we know it worked?" Ben asked. Dr. Chilton smiled through his visor. "That's the fun part," he said. "You should grab your camera. Second from the left." He motioned across the room. Ben scrambled over and tugged at one of the drawers. He pulled out a professional-looking camera and a big lens. He tried to put them together multiple times, but his shaking hands kept messing up the alignment. Wait. He held up his hands as Dr. Chilton walked over to the antechamber. Ben hurried over to me and put the camera in my hands. I held still, too afraid to move and possibly break the equipment. After a few more tries, his lens docked into the correct socket. He took it and started to press a few buttons. "Okay, I'm ready." Dr. Chilton turned back to the antechamber and walked over to the door. "Vivian, can you help me?" Dr. Jameson hurried over and slowly pulled the door open to reveal the antechamber. I stayed behind as everyone, minus Ben, surged forward to the bottleneck. Through the helmets and heads, I could see two people grasping at the wheel. "Say cheese." Ben pointed the camera at me. I didn't say cheese. I was too focused on the door. After a few repeated pulls, it started to turn. The intercom filled with a burst of excited chatter, and with a great, echoing thud, the door unlatched and swung outward. They all spilled out onto wet, spongy earth. I saw some splashes of water as a couple stumbled. Coming through the door was a bright ray of sunshine that extended through the antechamber. I covered my eyes for a moment before they adjusted and followed everyone out into the late Cretaceous. It was wonderful. I couldn't look at anything for long before another caught my eye. Every surface that wasn't water was cluttered with plants, ferns, cycads, what looked like a pine tree. I stumbled out after everyone and stopped. I needed to grab my collection equipment. I turned around and weaved past Ben to my drawers. When I pulled them open, there were 3 canisters the size of my forearm, as well as a spade and some pruners, like what you would use to prune rose bushes. I picked up one of the canisters and the hand spade and jogged back outside. The intercom was filled with bubbling, overlapping chatter. I couldn't make out any specific conversation happening. I tuned it out and scoured the surface with my eyes. The only thing going through my mind was, what could I study for the rest of my career? My eyes landed on a small, tufted fern a few yards away, about the thickness of my wrist. I hurried over and dropped to my knees. In the rear-view camera, I could see the others kick into gear and hurry back to their collection tools. The spade sank into the earth like it was butter. I almost moaned. Not gonna lie, I couldn't hear it completely, but I could feel the roots of the small fern crunch and pop under the stress of me pulling it out of the ground. I gingerly tugged multiple times until a fist-sized clump of roots pulled out of the earth beneath the fern. I carefully opened the canister and slid the fern down to the bottom of it. It looked sad inside the canister, without a swamp canopy to assess the trees. One caught my eye. It had large white flowers. Flowers meant pollen, and pollen meant more material to study. I ran over to collect the branches. They made a satisfying shick sound as I harvested them and stuffed them into the canister, along with a bunch of flowers. It was on my third trip that things went wrong. I left the shuttle with the intent to dig up a small gymnosperm, maybe a prehistoric pine. I spotted a small sapling about 15 yards to the right on the bank of a stretch of water. I jogged over and fell to my knees once again before extracting the tiny tree, only a foot tall at most. I reached down into the soil with the spade and cut through the deepest root. After scooping a few bits of muddy soil up, I dropped the plant into the canister. Some of the water to my right rippled. I looked over and saw something in the water. It was a tiny splash, barely a ripple. "Hey, Cruz," I asked over the comms. "Yeah?" he panted. "There might be some fish over where I am, about 15 yards to the right of the pod. Where are you located? I'm grabbing my last canister. I'll see you in a few moments." His huffing dominated my speaker for a moment. I stood up and held up my canister with my tiny plant and turned around to wave for Cruz. That was my mistake. His head bobbed over the ferns and shrubs like a disembodied apparition. I waved my hand high so he could more easily locate me. As I did that, I noticed the water splash in my rearview cam. It's stupid, really, that we thought being in a swamp was a smart idea. What I saw in that grainy footage will haunt me to this day. Over 15 feet of a rough, scaly spine rose up to the surface of the water. The splash was made by the tail, and I took a moment to process it. The tail. Was it that long? My body reacted before my mind could. It was like an electric shock that launched me over a yard forward. Just as the water erupted and a 40-foot-long alligator sprung from the water, I couldn't even scream as the giant mouth. God, as long as my body snapped shut right where I had been for a moment before. Two huge, yellow eyes perched on the top of the head, blinked quickly before readjusting. I tore in a great breath and screamed at the top of my lungs before sprinting away. All breathing on the comms stopped. The ground trembled behind me. I held tight to the canister and threw the spade behind me without looking. One look in the rearview camera, and all I saw was a maw and two huge, thick forelegs pinwheeling through the muck to get to me. I think Dr. Jameson discussed it once in a lecture. A crocodilian large enough that it ate dinosaurs, 6 to 7 tons. Teeth, marks had been found on dinosaur bones that matched, and that hissing monster was hot on my tail. I couldn't let it catch me. I had a horrifying vision. The crocodile would leap forward with a tremendous hiss, and the jaws would snap closed on a foot. Then, like all crocodilians, it would drag me back to the water and spin around until my bones snapped, or even worse, swallow me whole. Dinosuchus! I screamed. I sprinted into the brush, hoping that the increased cover would slow down the animal. I nearly ran into Cruz, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of delight and fear. Run, stupid! I slapped him on the back, and he sprinted after me. Branches snapped as the Dinosuchus barreled through the brush to us. Shrubbery and young trees were parted like the Red Sea, pushed aside as if by a mudslide. The radio was filled with chatter. Dinosuchus. What's a Dinosuchus? Is that the noise? Why is the ground trembling? Cruz ran to the left of the shuttle, and I instinctively ran to the right. A part of my eye trained on the rear-view camera and felt relieved when I saw that the Dinosuchus paused before pursuing Cruz. I felt a stab of guilt, but I was alive. I kept running and adjusted my course to get to everyone else. I dropped the canister onto the spongy earth, and Dr. Jameson ran towards me. The rumbling in the ground faded and then stilled. In the distance there was still the sound of branches snapping. Are you okay? What happened? I put my hands on my knees and sucked in great, heaving breaths. Dinosuchus ambushed me at the water's edge. I gasped for the air that kept pumping into my helmet. Followed Cruz, led away from shuttle. What's a Dinosuchus? Utah asked. A really big crocodile. Like, really big. Big enough to eat a T-Rex. Get away from the water. Dr. Jameson responded. Utah paled behind the glass of her helmet and shuffled away from the small pond near her. Cruz's gasping for breath echoed over the comms. Dr. Jameson was helping me up when we both heard him gasp a name. Dr. Potter. Look out, he wheezed. Look out. Run. We all froze as a weak scream echoed over the intercom, and then the Dinosuchus stopped running. The swamp went silent. I fumbled for the canister. We should get to the shuttle. Everyone nearby didn't hesitate and swiftly moved back on my arm. Is everyone else in the shuttle? Her voice was flat. A chorus of replies came back affirming it. We both reached out to the wheel and heaved the door shut, cutting out the harsh sunlight and leaving us in the fluorescent glow. It took more effort than I was willing to admit, turning the wheel and locking the door. Everyone, Dr. Chilton said. We need to leave. Cruz nodded. His body limped like an accordion in his chair. I scuffed over to my seat and collapsed into it. The others followed suit. I was fumbling with the buckle along with everyone else when a voice came over the comms again. No, please, Dr. Potter said. It was fuzzy, but it was her. Please, don't leave. We all froze and looked at each other in stunned silence. She was alive. Dr. Potter, can you hear me? Chilton said. Yes. A weak reply, but stronger, clearer. Utah put a hand over her heart and held back a sob. Can you make it to the door? Has the Dinosuchus left you alone? A beat of silence. No, it got me. Please don't leave. Her voice jerked, and she let out a low moan. I don't want to die alone. Oh my God. Ben raised his hands to the sides of his helmet. I think she's inside it right now. A broken sob fluttered through the speakers. I felt suddenly nauseous and hugged my stomach. I listened in horror as the same cracking I heard on the other side of the wall played over the comm. Her helmet was cracking under the pressure. Please, please don't leave me. Her voice turned to weak sobs and more cracking. Her breath hitched for a moment. and the cracking morphed into a splintering. Please, please stay. It became more intense for a moment, followed by the tight wheezing as some terrifying pressure contracted over her body. Then, with a sick grunt, her last word, ugh! The cracking stopped suddenly and was replaced with a low rumble. Both Texas and Ben twisted their helmets off and leaned to the side to vomit. I looked away as the retching filled my helmet. After a few moments, like a zombie, I began to fasten the buckles over my chest. After I was done, I stared down at the small conifer in my hands. I looked up again when Dr. Chilton asked us all if we were ready to leave. We all raised our hands. The comms cut off without another word. The trip back to the future was rough. The whole time, I kept the plant close to my chest, and when I heard cracking on the other side of the wall, I blocked it out. We arrived back with another long slide, perhaps us sliding into the right time. After we stopped moving, we all sat in silence. When the comms flicked back on, multiple people were sniffing. I took a big, deep breath and let it out. My diaphragm collapsed as I burst into tears with everyone else. I should have said no. I should have taken a thesis opportunity in Wyoming, North Dakota, or Australia. But instead, I traveled back to the Cretaceous and haven't been the same since. I am never going back to church again. It's the middle of the year, and it's around this time that my youth group would have what we call a retreat. It's basically like church camp, but for Catholics, where you all would gather around and listen to Bible studies and share what you've learned with each other, along with other activities. The church was old. I mean very old. It has been around since the Spanish colonization, and they haven't really renovated it that much, but it's pretty big. And there is a room with a ton of bunk beds where the choir would usually sleep if a mass was held at an ungodly hour of the day, and is where me and the rest of my fellow church members would spend the rest of the week. Nothing really happened to us in the past 3 days. It had been fun to say the least. We played music, did the rosary every afternoon, go to confession, ate, and did a whole lot of other stuff. But it was on the 4th day when I had fallen ill. It was probably because I kept on skipping meals, but the state of my body didn't allow me to join any more of the activities. So I was advised by the youth leader to rest and stay at the back room where the bunk beds were. I was pretty upset, of course. I had never missed a single activity, and it didn't help that I had FOMO, so I had no other choice but to stay put. It was already 2 a.m., and I was awoken to the sound of praying. I was confused at first, and in my tired and exhausted state, I shrugged it off and told myself that it was probably just one of my church mates that came to the room early, though it's quite odd for them to be doing the rosé at this hour. So I just left it at that and went back to sleep. During breakfast, after everyone was finished talking about how much fun they had last night, that obviously annoyed me a little because I had to miss out on all the fun, I asked if someone went back early to the room and did the rosary while I slept. They all looked at me like I was telling a joke. Before they all looked at each other and let out a loud and obnoxious, "Huh?" I stopped. Hours later, a man dressed in a black suit and wearing a black hat that nearly covered his eyes entered the motel. He looked like a businessman, or maybe a traveling salesman. "Can I have one room at the back?" he asked in a deep, heavy voice. "Sure," I replied, handing him a key. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I brushed it off and went back to my desk. I was dozing off when a loud, agonized scream jolted me awake. It came from the back of the motel, where the young woman was staying. Miss, are you okay? I shouted as I knocked on her door. No response. I knocked again. Miss, still no response. The scream I'd heard earlier had been blood-curdling. I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a spare key, I unlocked her door and stepped inside. The room was empty. It looked as though no one had ever been there. My mind raced. Then I remembered. All the guests that night had been regulars, except for the lost young woman and the man in the black suit. I ran to the man's room and knocked. No answer. Using my spare key again, I unlocked his door. Empty, as if no one had ever been there. After searching the entire motel and finding nothing, I had no choice but to let it go. For the next few weeks, everything returned to normal. Most of the guests were regulars, with a few new ones, usually truck drivers or travelers passing through. No sign of the lost woman, no sign of the man in the suit. Then, one night, the door to the motel opened, and a young lady walked in. She looked eerily similar to the first lost woman, not in appearance, but in her demeanor. She too seemed lost and disoriented. I had a bad feeling. Less than an hour after she went to her room, another guest entered, an old woman with gray hair, dressed in a black suit. Two different set of people, somehow eerily looked alike, with each other, with their unsettling similarities. I handed the old woman in a black suit a key to one of the rooms at the back, silently hoping the night would pass without incident, but I was wrong. An hour later, I heard another scream, a woman's scream, loud and filled with pain, coming from the back. Just like before, I rushed to the young woman's room and unlocked it with my spare key. Empty. I hurried to the old woman's room and opened it. Empty. I had no idea what the hell had happened. Was it happened some other time, before I bought the motel from the previous owner? I didn't like disturbing an old man who was enjoying his rest at night, but this could affect the business. If he knew something about it, he had some explaining to do. Oh, the old man who previously owned the motel muttered, I haven't told you about it. Nope, I replied. Well, this happened several times before. More than I could count, he started. But our regular customers had used to it. Apart from the screaming and the two guests being missing, nothing else had happened. Well, it's true, I said. But what happened, though? The motel, young man, he explained, is located at the center of two worlds. The world of the living and the world of the dead. I was stunned. Is that supposed to be a joke? No, it's not, he said firmly. And how does this explain the strange occurrences? The people you see entering the motel, those who seem lost and disoriented, they're lost souls, ghosts, if you prefer. They've run away from the afterlife, trying to find a way back to the world of the living, the old man explained. There was no way of getting back to life. Once you're dead, of course, he continued. But the motel is like half-spiritual world, located at the very center of both worlds. These wandering souls didn't realize they were dead. They saw a motel, and they entered looking for a place to rest. And the people in suits? The screaming? I asked impatiently. The people in suits, he continued, are deaths. Deaths? Plural? Yes, deaths. You didn't think there was just one, did you? There are many. They come here to find the runaway souls and drag them back to the afterlife. So, the screams I heard, I murmured, it's the scream of the runaway souls being dragged back by force to the afterlife. Okay, Mr. Landorf, I said, exasperated. From what I understand, I get that this thing happened on its own. There's nothing we could do about it. Very true. But the screams, Mr. Landorf, they were loud and painful. Everyone at the motel could hear them. I could lose customers. Nah, the motel's regular customers already got used to it. Mr. Landorf brushed my thought off. Apart from the screams, nothing else had happened, right? And it was just one screams per night, so this old man started to sound like he took things way too lightly. Yeah, he got used to it, I get it. But how about new customers, Mr. Landorf? I got plenty of new customers too, I asked, worried. You have two things to try, he explained. First, inform the new customers, when they arrive at the motel, to ignore any screams they hear. The motel is located in a deserted area. It's not uncommon for weird things to happen. I'm not sure I like the first option, but carry on, I said. Second, he proceeded, when the lost, wandering souls ask for a room, give them a room at the front, not at the back, the closest to the lobby. I frowned. Why? Wouldn't it just make things worse? More customers would hear the screams. Have you ever seen the runaway souls entering the motel from the back? No. It's because half of the motel that stands on the spiritual world is the front side, not the back. You heard the screams because the souls were dragged from the living world at the back side of the motel to the dead world at the front. Putting the runaway souls in the front room, Mr. Landorf concluded, would prevent their screaming from being heard when they are dragged back to the afterlife by deaths, because the afterlife is at the front. Now, that was relieving. Kinda. I quit being a serial killer because of a terrifying experience involving a cat in a tree. I used to be a screenwriter. Well, I suppose I still am, technically, but I don't write anymore. I can't. It's been months since I dropped everything and walked away from that project, and I haven't touched a script since. That show, being a serial killer, it was supposed to be a breakthrough, a high-concept, dark drama. At first, the ideas were exciting, the potential, endless. But then, everything changed. I was halfway through a rewrite for the pilot episode when it happened. I can't bring myself to say what, not yet. Not until I'm sure. But what I saw, what I felt, I can still hear it, sometimes, in the silence. Now I'm back to searching for work, pretending things are normal. But it's hard to ignore the weight of the trauma, the nightmare that follows me, and the nagging feeling that I didn't just leave the show behind. Something followed me out. I used to relish every moment of it. You know, being a serial killer. It was in my veins, like I was born for it. It was cutting edge, the way I'd craft each kill, shaping my own signature with precision. Some people collect stamps, others hoard antiques. Me? I collected lives, and I was damn good at it. I didn't just slaughter, I created. Each victim, carefully selected, was a canvas waiting for my bloody brushstrokes. I was ruthless, sure, but that was the point. There was a rhythm, a flow to it, like a perfectly composed symphony of terror, where every note had to be hit just right. The chase with the detectives, delicious. It wasn't just about the killing anymore. It was the game, the back and forth, the thrill of watching them think they had me cornered, only for me to slip away like a shadow. And when they thought they understood my pattern, when they thought they were one step ahead, I'd throw in a twist, keep them on their toes. It was a real killer instinct. You can't really call it a hobby, though, can you? It's more than that. It was my craft, the way I meticulously planned every slice, every cut of the knife. It wasn't just murder, it was art. And as for the gore, well, I didn't just spill it. I painted with it. Each drop, each splash, it was part of the masterpiece. Being a serial killer wasn't just what I did. It wasn't just another writing gig I had become completely immersed in and obsessed with. It was who I was. Behind the scenes of being a serial killer, it wasn't the creative process that consumed me. It was the grind, the endless grind. Hours spent brainstorming, writing, rewriting, refining. It was all for nothing, really. At least, that's how it felt. The pay barely covered rent, let alone the therapy sessions I was already starting to need. But, of course, no one cared. Being a writer on a show was nothing more than a joke to the showrunners, who spent more time puffing up their egos than actually considering what went into making the thing. You were just a cog in the machine, your ideas ground down into dust by the relentless, soulless demands of the industry. Every meeting was an exercise in humiliation. They'd ignore everything I said, dismiss my suggestions without a second thought, while fawning over some intern who couldn't even spell serial killer correctly, let alone understand the depths of a character's motivations. Meanwhile, I was stuck fixing dialogue for characters who were barely more than caricatures of the twisted art I wanted to create. But the worst part? The title. The one thing I had fought to keep authentic. Being a serial killer was my vision, raw and unapologetic. But they hated it. The execs, the showrunners, the suits, whatever you want to call them, they couldn't care less about the soul of the show. No, they wanted something marketable, something more mainstream. And so, it was changed. Living with a killer, I should have seen the writing on the wall then. The shadow hanging over everything, thick and cold. The producers wanted a cat. A cat, the whole damn world felt like it was against me. But none more so than this cat, Ms. Informal, as they called her, or Snuggles in the script. Whatever the hell that meant, I had a creeping suspicion that her name was the least of my problems. Animal handlers were rushing past me, their faces flushed with urgency. They were frantic, searching high and low, whispering her name, but all I could hear in the background was the dull hum of the coffee maker as I neared the break room, and my own bitter thoughts. I should have let it go, but I couldn't. I was in the break room, staring at the coffee machine, trying to ignore the growing weight in my chest. I ordered my coffee, black, of course, and stood there, feeling the heat of the machine, the sound of the steam pressing against my skull. Focus, I told myself. Focus on anything but the cat. That's when I saw it, a tail. No one else was around, and the place felt oddly still. In a moment of sheer stupidity, I reached out and lifted the tablecloth, just to get a glimpse, just to see if I could finally put an end to the stupid, persistent feeling of tension the cat had caused. I didn't mean to do it. Really, I didn't. But something in me snapped, something deep in the pit of my stomach. I lifted the cloth, and there she was, her wide, glossy eyes fixed on mine, a flash of fear darting across her face. I swear I didn't mean to scare her, but when she bolted, when she shot out from under the table, like a bolt of lightning, my gut twisted. I had made her do that. She ran straight for the window. My heart raced as she leapt up onto the sill, and in that single, terrifying moment, I could only watch in horror as she launched herself into the air. My breath caught. I'd startled her so badly. I thought I'd killed her. I was sick to my stomach, my mind spinning as I rushed to the window. My hands trembled as I looked down, expecting to see a lifeless, mangled body sprawled out below. But instead, the coffee burned my chest as I spilled it, the sudden pain of the hot liquid shocking me into a harsh, involuntary yell. And then I heard her, the cat's cry, a sharp, panicked meow. She hadn't hit the ground. She'd landed on a tree branch, and now she was stuck, too scared to move. For a brief moment, I stood frozen there, chest searing with pain, the burning of the coffee mingling with the crushing weight of guilt. And yet, it was almost like something else was taking over. A strange, protective feeling rose inside me, a deep urge to make things right, to save her. Without thinking, I pushed the window open further, the cool air rushing in. My head spun with confusion, guilt, and fear, but none of it stopped me. Crawled out onto the windowsill, ignoring the stinging heat on my chest, and reached for the branch. My hand shook, but I climbed out further, inching closer to where she was stuck. The tree was low enough for me to reach, but she seemed so helpless, so fragile. I could hear her cries, soft and terrified, and it was then, as my fingertips brushed the bark, that I realized something. I was trying to save a cat, after everything I had done. Maybe I wasn't the villain in this story after all. I had to get her down. I was almost there. The burning in my chest, the searing pain from the coffee spill, was fading now, replaced by something colder, something more urgent. Ms. Informal was perched on the branch, her eyes fixed on me. Her fur looked strange in the moonlight, darker, almost oily. She didn't move. When I crawled closer, not an inch. Her eyes never left me, as if she were waiting. I stretched out my hand, trembling, heart hammering in my chest. I had to help her. I couldn't leave her here, stuck on this branch. But as my fingers brushed her fur, something was wrong. It wasn't the softness I expected. No, this was slick, too slick, cold, like rubber. My skin crawled. I pulled my hand back, but before I could react, I heard it. The meow, but it wasn't right. The sound was off, too high-pitched, distorted, like it was coming from the wrong throat, the wrong creature. And then, before I could even make sense of it, she made a sound that didn't belong, a shriek. It wasn't a meow. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard from a cat. It was a jagged, bone-shaking wail, that vibrated deep in my chest. My vision blurred with the sound, the world around me trembling, and that's when it happened. The fur split open. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow transformation. One moment, she was a cat. The next, she was ripping open like a cheap costume. A seam ran down her back, a line of darkness, and then she split apart. I froze. My hand was still stuck in the mess, sinking deeper into the writhing thing that wasn't a cat. It was worse than any nightmare. Beneath the fur, beneath the mask of normality, was something wrong. It was like spaghetti. No, worse, like spaghetti and meatballs, if they were made of maggots and gore, a wet, glistening mass of wriggling, slimy tendrils. It oozed and squirmed, pulsing with unnatural life. The texture was all wrong, slick and sticky under my fingers, like I was touching something alive, but not alive, something that should not exist. I tried to pull my hand back. I wanted to pull away, but it was as if my fingers were glued to it, sucked into the mass of writhing filth. And then it shrieked again. Not a meow, not a scream. This was a scream, a wail that vibrated through my skull, rattling my brain, clawing into my mind. The thing inside her was alive, something alien, something wrong. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My vision blurred. The tree tilted. The world around me cracked, splintering, breaking into pieces. I felt myself falling. It wasn't slow. It wasn't graceful. I plummeted, the ground rushing up at me in a terrifying blur. My limbs flailed, my chest tight from the burning pain. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. My screams mixed with the thing's wails, and then, crash. When I woke, I was in a hospital room. It was so quiet, too quiet. The white walls, the sterile air, it all felt wrong. My body ached, but there was a strange detachment, as if I wasn't fully present in it. It was like waking up from a nightmare. But instead of relief, I felt empty. I blinked, confused. The room was too clean, too peaceful. I didn't know how I got here. My chest was still burning from the coffee, but it didn't feel like it was mine anymore. My head spun, and then it hit me. The tree. Her. That thing. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. I bolted upright, panic flooding me. The memory of what I had touched, what I had felt, slammed into me like a freight train. My stomach lurched. I screamed. It came out of me, raw, desperate, the sound scratching at my throat. I tried to stand, but my limbs weren't cooperating. My arms were weak, my body unsteady. I thrashed in the bed, the sheets tangling around my legs as the terror surged through me. "Get off me," I screamed, my voice shaking. I can't. The door swung open. 2 men stepped. Inside, their faces blank, expressionless. One of them was the producer, the other was a lawyer. They didn't seem surprised to see me like this. Not the way I was, thrashing in panic. They didn't even blink. "Are you okay?" the producer asked, his voice flat, like he was reading from a script. The lawyer didn't even look at me, his eyes glued to his clipboard. "We need to know when you'll be able to finish the script, or if we need to replace you." Replace me? I froze. Replace me? They wanted to replace me. The horror surged back in a flood of nausea. The cat, the thing, I could still feel it, the cold wetness of it, the shriek ringing in my ears. I snapped. The laugh bubbled out of me, manic, wild. Replace me, I yelled, my voice rising. Yeah, replace me. I'm done. I'm finished. I won't be coming back. The laughter was bubbling up like a broken dam, spilling from my mouth in a cracked, deranged sound. Their eyes were wide now, but they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. I leaned forward, my eyes wild. You got a cat, I shouted, pointing at them, my words slurring into madness. She's some cat, I cackled. It wasn't a laugh, it was a howl, a cry of madness, of terror, of freedom. They didn't get it. They didn't see it. She's some cat, I shouted, louder and louder, the sound echoing in the sterile room. You got a cat. You don't know what's in there, but I do. Later, I felt much better, and I made a full recovery. I went home and thought about how I might enjoy a job as a trash collector or a pool boy, or perhaps as a bartender. I don't think I'll ever write anything ever again, though, and that might be the worst of it. I just don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to doing what I loved. I don't think about being a serial killer anymore. I'm well cured of all that goronography and nightmare fuel. In fact, I doubt I'll ever write again. I found my wife's obituary online, but she's sitting right next to me. I am chronically online. I Google lots of things and people when I'm bored. I've Googled my own name before, along with friends, acquaintances, conspiracy theories, and random internet sundries. But last night was the first time I'd Googled my wife's name, and I found something I'd never forget. The first hit was an obituary. Of course, I assumed it was someone with the same name as her. Her first name is Emily, and her last name is pretty common. Not going to share it here, because I don't want to be doxxed. But I clicked it anyway, just out of curiosity. My heart fell through the floor when I saw a photo of my wife on the website. Blonde highlighted hair, dark eyes, and the dates matched up too. 1986, 2012. According to this obituary, she'd died when she was 26. I met her when she was 27. There's no way, I thought. This must just be someone who looks like her, with her name and her birth year. But I knew it was too many coincidences to be wrong. When I read the actual obituary, it only cemented things for me. It mentioned her love of horses, her volunteer work at a soup kitchen, through her church, and her work as a biologist postdoc. So many details matched up. There was no way it could be a coincidence. What you looking at? I jumped as my wife came in from the kitchen and sat down next to me. On instinct, I slammed the laptop shut. Nothing, I said. Then, realizing how suspicious I looked, I added, I was looking at birthday gifts for you. For a second, her face froze, and I was worried she wouldn't buy my lie. But then she smiled. That warm smile I loved, crinkling her eyes at the corners. That's so sweet, she said, coming to sit next to me. I swallowed. Yeah. She cuddled up next, to me, but I felt completely on edge. The warmth of her skin no longer felt warm and inviting. In fact, a chill ran down my spine. After a few minutes, I extricated myself from her embrace. I don't feel good, I lied. I'm going to lie down. Oh, okay, she said, pouting. Before she could say anything more, I ran upstairs. As soon as I got on the bed, I brought up the obituary again. I stared at the grainy image of her face. It was definitely her. That warm smile, those mysterious dark eyes. There was no way it could be anyone else. I scrolled through some of the other results, and I realized some of those too were related to her death. There was a Facebook memorial page, friends posting on it, names I didn't recognize, mourning her loss more than 10 years ago. The university she worked at had put out a statement with their condolences as well. But then I found something that made my heart stop, a news article nestled at the bottom of the search results page. Emily hadn't just died. She'd been murdered. My jaw hung open as I read the news article. Phrases popped out at me. No signs of forced entry, partially dismembered, and killer still at large. The news article didn't have a photo of Emily, though, so maybe this was a different Emily. It had to be. It couldn't be my Emily, who was sitting on the couch watching TV downstairs. A sound jolted me out of my thoughts. The door to the bedroom, creaking open. Emily stood in the doorway, oddly still. The hall light was off, shrouding her face in shadow. Emily? I asked, my voice shaking. I came up to check on you, she said, in a soft, cool voice. Thanks, I said, quickly turning off my phone and slipping it behind me. I'm feeling a lot better now. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear that, she said, her voice going lower. I tried to keep my cool as she climbed into bed with me. I lay there, stiff and cold, as she wrapped her arms around me. I love you, baby, she whispered, as she cuddled with me under the covers. I love you too, so that's where I am now. I'm writing this from my phone, as Emily sleeps next to me. I don't know if I'm safe here. I don't know who or what I'm dealing with. All kinds of crazy scenarios have been floating through my mind. Did Emily have an identical twin that died, and she took over the twin's identity? Is she some horrible creature from folk tales who killed Emily and took on her appearance? The more minutes that tick by, the wilder my theories get. None of them make sense. There's only one thing I'm sure of. Whoever or whatever I'm sleeping next to isn't the real Emily. The haunted crib go out at night, and you will see the face on the moon staring down at thee. If he smiles, sweet dreams come true. If he frowns, he'll come for you. Old German folk song. That's such a creepy song, Anne said, shaking her head. Your parents would sing it to you every night? I shrugged. It wasn't the only song they sang to me as a kid, I said, feeling the need to defend my folks. But it was a family tradition, going back generations, like before my ancestors came to the U.S. as old. I've never heard of it before. Outside of my family, I really haven't either. I understand why, obviously, but the last part never bothered me. Never saw the face in the moon frown? Never saw the face on the moon, I said. You aren't thinking of singing that to our kid, are you? Anne rubbed her very pregnant belly out of habit. I didn't respond right away. She knew what I was thinking, and started shaking her head no before the words leapt from my lips. I mean, it's tradition, after all. No way, she said. I don't want to give our kid a complex. It won't. I heard it all the time, and I'm okay. Anne smirked, and I rolled my eyes, anticipating the joke. I cut it off at the pass. You married me. In fact, you couldn't wait to get in on these family traditions. She burst out laughing, and it made me smile. Her laugh, a huge blurt, followed by nearly soundless cackles, made my heart sing, even more so when I saw her swollen belly bob up and down with joy. "Can I think about it at least?" she asked. "I want to ask around to see if anyone else has ever heard this lullaby." I said sure. We changed the subject and went back to assembling the crib. Our son Mac was due in a few weeks, and we'd fallen behind in prepping his room. It wasn't totally our fault. Needing to stretch our money, we bought a crib secondhand from someone who lived across the country. Anne found it during her late-night web, crawling through Facebook groups. There were options locally, but they all looked like cheap death traps. I'm sure they were fine, but when Anne laid eyes on this one, it was love at first sight. She had to have it. It was an antique, but very well maintained. The seller said it had been a family heirloom they inherited when their parents died. Since the seller had no kids, nor plans to have any, they put it up for sale. Oddly, they couldn't move the piece, and the price kept dropping. When it fell into Anne's target range, she sprung. Even with a higher shipping cost, it was cheaper than something new from Amazon. The crib arrived in 4 boxes. The seller, who left no return address, had carefully pried apart the pieces and shipped them in separate containers. As expected, there were issues with the shipping, and we got the pieces at different times. The last box arrived yesterday, so we were reassembling it, carefully. "I can't believe they took this thing apart," I said. "This is old-world craftsmanship." "I know," Anne said, beaming. "It's stunning, isn't it?" It really was. The old-world artisan had made the crib from mahogany wood, so it was as sturdy as can be. The color was a rich brown with the faintest highlights of red, but the carvings on the head and footboards took this from a delightful piece of furniture to a room centerpiece. In the center of the headboard was a carving of a smiling sun, their eyes cast down into the crib. The carved radiating rays went all the way to the edges of the board. Along the top, the artist carved what looked like cats, all following a crawling toddler. The footboard was just as intricately designed. In the middle was the moon, another face looking down at the crib with a Mona Lisa smile. The craftsman had carved the different phases in an arc, radiating from each side of the central moon. If you started from the left and followed along, the face would gradually appear as more of the moon came into view. A full, smiling face greeted you at its height before phasing back to nothing. On the right, carved figures depicting medieval townspeople who lived and worked in a small town adorned the top. We made out most of them: butchers, bakers, blacksmiths, farmers, but a few were a mystery to us, especially the man in the middle. It looked like a musician, but he was playing an instrument I'd never seen before. It kind of looked like a cow's horn, but I wasn't positive. It was seeing this smiling moon face that had dislodged the lullaby from my memory. When Mac moves out of this, how much do you think we can sell this for? I asked, carefully assembling the legs to the base. We're not selling this, Anne said instantly. This is now our heirloom to pass down. Until our kid sells it on their preferred social media marketplace sometime in the future. It'll probably be called Happy Time or French Pea or something. If we raise little Mac right, he'll hold on to it forever, she said, rubbing her belly. Again, I can already tell he's a good boy. We finished putting the crib together and I moved it into place. We took a step back to admire it. Anne was right. As usual, this was a stunning piece of furniture. She leaned her head against my shoulder. We're actually doing this, huh? Becoming parents. Crazy, I said, slinging my arm around her waist. I'm going to be someone's dad. Jesus, she laughed. You're going to be a great dad. Only if I sing my family's traditional song to them. She laughed. Not a chance. Can I get you to rub my feet? They're killing me. A few hours later, we headed to bed. Bedtime had gotten earlier and earlier as the pregnancy advanced. I assumed it was the body's biolo. She pointed up again. Off to the side. The darker spots looked like a face. See it? No. It's smiling. I rolled my eyes. Are you fucking with me? No, I swear, she said. Do you honestly not see it? I don't. I confessed. It just looks like the moon. Hold on a second. She grabbed her phone, zoomed in, and snapped a photo. She showed me and pointed at what she said was a smiling face. See it? Kinda, but not really. Wow. Do you see any face at all? I looked back up at the full moon. Nope, I said, scanning the surface for anything that might trick my mind, and finding nothing. What do I get again if I see a smiling face? Sweet treats. I could use a snack. Dreams. Sweet dreams, I corrected. Does this mean that we can sing the song to Mac now? Not if there's a chance he'll see a frowning moon. The world is already fracturing. We don't need to add on some lunar curses for good measure, Anne said. You coming to bed? Go ahead, I said, still staring up at the moon. I think I caught a second wind. I'm gonna stay up for a bit. Don't be up too late. Remember, we have that appointment tomorrow. I kissed her forehead and sent her back to bed. Within minutes, Anne was asleep. She's like a robot in that way. She just powers down. The pregnancy has made it easier for her to slip away to the land of Nod. I was tired, but I was also curious. And seeing a face on the moon really hit me. I wasn't jealous. Well, maybe a little. But I suddenly had a desire to look up the lullaby's origins. I hopped on my computer and started searching, but came up empty. There wasn't a single thing out there about the song. I glanced at the clock and saw it was just after 10. My dad, a notorious night owl, was probably still up. I decided to give him a call and see if he knew anything. He picked up on the second ring. Everything okay with my grandkid? Yes, I said. Mac and Anne are fine. Thank God, he said, chuckling. I can't begin to tell you how nervous I am on your behalf. I'm so worried something bad is going to happen. Never had this when your mom was pregnant with you. Maybe I wasn't as important to you as your first grandbaby. I joked. He laughed. Yeah, that must be it. What's going on? Why the late night call? I have a random question for you. You remember the nursery rhyme you guys used to sing to me when I was a kid? I sang a lot of songs. The one about the moon smiling and frowning. The old German one? Oh yeah, he said. That one wasn't odd. I hadn't thought about it for years, but it popped back into my head when you were born. It's probably because my folks sang it to me all the time as a kid. It was strange. Maybe that part of your brain gets activated when you finally have a little one. What do you know about it? Not much, admittedly. My parents sang it to me, and they're sang it to them. It was some old family tradition, kind of like Hank the Elf, you know? Hank the Elf was Santa's magical helper who would leave me chocolates in a sock I hung off my dresser every night in December. Sometimes we'd exchange notes. Even after I knew Hank was my dad, I'd still write notes to Hank, and like clockwork, he'd write back. I couldn't wait to do that with Mac. It's weird. I can't find anything about it online. Like, nothing. No lyrics, no history, no recorded melody. It just doesn't exist anywhere outside of our family. That is odd. My parents always told me it was an old folk song, and I had no reason to doubt it. There's seriously nothing? Look yourself, I said. I heard him typing away on his computer. A few seconds later, he sighed. Well, ain't that something? Did our ancient ancestors make up the song and never spread it around? I don't know, he said. Maybe you can check in with a professor of mythology, or music, or Middle Age history. They might shed some light on it. Maybe it was part of a ritual or something, I said, half jokingly. Maybe the elders were witches or something. He laughed. If they were, and I never got the ability to cast spells, I'm going to be so upset. We bullshitted a little before I told him about the new crib. I switched over to FaceTime and went into Mac's room. I showed him the crib, and he was impressed. He adored the little carvings, but worried they might be a choking hazard if Mac broke them off. I hadn't thought of that, I said. You will. As soon as the boy arrives, your dad brain kicks in, and all you'll be able to think about is all the ways everyday items inside your house might spell death for your kids. It's exhausting. We've already started baby-proofing cabinets, I said. I hate the lock so much. He laughed. I thought you were going to do a dinosaur theme in his room. When did you switch to a storybook theme? We didn't switch. Then why? Get a bed with figures from the Pied Piper on it? What? The guy in the middle is playing a flute. That doesn't make him the Pied Piper. But then why is the other side a bunch of rats being led by a toddler? Those are cats, I said. Son, you may want to look at them again. I walked over to the crib and inspected the carved animals closely. From afar, I swore they were cats. But up close, there was no denying I was wrong. They were rats. Son of a bitch. You're right. They are rats. The teeth weren't a giveaway? He asked. I hadn't even paid attention, to be honest. I doubt Annie did, because when she mentioned it to me a few weeks ago, she said something about cats. Parent brain comes for us all. Consider this the first of many times you'll be too tired or emotionally drained to think straight. Welcome to the club. We chatted a bit more before saying our goodbyes and hanging up. I'd been half paying attention to what my dad was saying for a couple of reasons. For one, he was going long on an article he read once, years ago, that talked about the story of the actual Pied Piper. In my dad's typical storytelling fashion, he included every fact or half-remembered fact that ended up muddying the narrative. Apparently, a bunch of kids in 1200s Germany died or went missing or something. Some people said the piper was a metaphor for death. Some said he was real, and others said he was a witch. I don't know. Dad was all over the place. For two, I couldn't shake the image of the Pied Piper being carved into a crib. Why in the world would anyone ever make a bed with that as the theme? The guy ends up drowning all those kids. Who would want a nightly reminder of that? A thought streaked across my brain. What would Anne think when I told her about this in the morning? How crushed would she be? She loved this crib. I turned to leave the room when I heard a car turn down our street, blasting a bass-heavy song. It was so loud it rattled our indoor fixtures. I opened up the blinds, flooding the room with moonlight, and glared out. I spied a lifted truck with blue running lights slowly driving down our street. They seemed determined to wake up the whole goddamn neighborhood. Then I chuckled to myself. Jesus, I'm becoming an old man already. This kid has aged me. I went to pull the blinds back down when I glanced up at the full moon. That's when I saw it. My jaw went slack, and I could hear blood whooshing in my ears. Tears welled up and burst, rolling down my frozen face. I hadn't wanted to believe Anne earlier because it sounded so impossible. And yet, here it was, looking down at me, a face on the moon, and he was frowning. Oh, phoo, I said before I heard something snap behind me. I turned and looked, but saw nothing out of place. At first, in the yellow moonlight, I saw what had snapped. A single figure had been ripped from the crib, the Pied Piper. I flipped on the light, but couldn't see where the figure had fallen. I didn't know how it had snapped off. The figure must have cracked during shipping and finally broken off the railing. That seemed far-fetched, though. I'd seen the Piper figure firmly attached earlier, but what else could it be? Nothing running through my brain made sense. It was just me in here, and it's not like it broke itself off the crib. It was just a piece of wood. I ran over to the crib and flung off the mattress. The figure had disappeared. I was about to move the crib aside to check behind the dresser next to it when I froze. The moon's smiling face on the footboard had changed to a frown. The sun on the headboard was gone altogether. I let go of the railing like it was electrified and stumbled back. In the corner of my mind, I heard the faintest notes from a flute play. My eyes caught the shadow of a man dart behind me. That was my cue to get the hell out. I bolted out, slamming the door behind me. I turned to make sure nothing had followed me out of the room. There was nothing. I waited a second or two, just to make sure. What are you doing? It was Anne. The shock of hearing her voice made me scream. You feeling okay? I saw a face, on the moon. She looked crushed. She walked over to me and stroked my arm. You saw a frown, didn't you? I did. Well, you know what that means, right? She asked, staring deeply into my eyes. It means you're going to die. That shocked me. Why would you say that? Because I'm going to be the one who kills you. I yanked my arm away from her touch. I tried to respond, but my voice died in my throat. My wife, my beautiful, lovely, sweet wife, had just threatened to kill me in her normal, honeyed voice. It was as matter of fact as if she asked me to switch the laundry over. We locked eyes, and she smiled wide, too wide. The skin at the corners of her mouth cracked and slowly, but violently pulled apart. The skin tore in strips, and blood spurted from the wounds. She didn't react at all. Instead, she crammed her hands into the sides of her mouth. She squeezed down on the shredded flaps. Her fingers as tight as a V. The firework explosion of blooming flowers drew my eyes away from the sky. They were the most exquisite colors I'd ever seen. Unnaturally vibrant. Not long after, fat black and yellow bumblebees zigzagged in a blossom to drink up the alluring nectar. It felt like I had stepped into a painting. Everything was so real, but it had a sheen of artificiality. As much as the music rendered this serene image in front of me and urged me to let go, a dark corner of my brain was screaming for me to wake up from the illusion. My monkey brain knew something was wrong. What's all the racket? It was Anne, the real Anne. She emerged from our bedroom, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The return of her voice, her real voice, helped light up the darkened part of my brain. The art project melted away, and the gore returned. I saw Anne's horrified face and heard my scared subconscious screaming again. "Run!" I yelled. I pushed past the Pied Piper, grabbed Anne's hand, and yanked her along toward the front door. She stumbled, and only through an act of God and many intense arm workouts did I keep her upright. If we fell, I knew we'd be goners. I grabbed my keys, whipped open the door, and we took off for the car. "Get in! Get in!" I yelled, fumbling with the keys to the car. "What's happening?" I saw a face on the moon. It was frowning. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her facial reaction said everything. We both slid into the car. I fired up the engine and glanced over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't about to take out some poor sap walking his dog late at night. When I turned it back to the house, I saw the Pied Piper standing in the doorway. He wasn't alone. All of those wooden rats had ripped themselves off the crib and had come to life. Only they weren't the size of regular rats, not even the size of burly New York subway rats. These things were as big as Rottweilers. Like the Piper, they had no features, save for razor-sharp teeth. What the hell are those? Rats. From where? The crib, I said. Our crib? After tonight, it's the Dump's crib. Buckle up. The Piper played music, but I couldn't hear it this time. But the rats could. They turned their attention toward my car. The lead rat hunched down and launched themselves onto my hood. It misjudged the slickness of my car and fell off. But by that time, the second rat was airborne. I jammed the car into gear and slammed on the gas pedal. My car rocketed backward into the street. The rats kept coming. A third and a fourth leapt through the air and landed on my trunk. They started biting the metal, and much to my amazement, the metal started crunching. What do we do? Can we stop this? An idea popped into my brain. I threw my phone at Anne. "Call my dad. I have to ask him about the song." She dialed his number. I heard a pop from my back driver's side tire. As she did, the air came screaming out. It sounded like someone in distress. The passenger side rear went too, and the back of my car dropped. I shifted into drive and pressed on the gas. My car lurched forward, but something caught in the tires and kept us from escaping. A rat had wedged itself in the wheel well. We couldn't move forward. I switched to reverse, to rock out of it, but it was to no avail. We were stuck. "Hello." It was my dad's sleepy voice. "Is something... Are there more words to the lullaby?" I screamed. "What?" More metal crushing from the back, and now the rear doors. The rats were eating through the goddamn car. My heart dropped when I saw the empty car seat in the back. A horrid thought flashed in my brain. Would I even get a chance to meet Mac? The Piper kept playing. The rats kept eating. I kept panicking, but I held it long enough to ask, "Dad, what are the other words to the song?" Uh, I used to only sing the, hold on, Gail, Gail. What were the words to that horrid German song we used to sing? I could hear my mom waking from her sleep. Simultaneously, another rat jumped on the hood of the car. It hissed and started gnashing at the windshield. Anne screamed. That got my mom moving. What's wrong? My mom asked, her voice panicking. I'll fill you in later. What about the song? Go out at night and, no, after that, after the moon frowning. Let me think. The windshield spiderwebbed as the rat broke a small hole in the glass. Mom, hurry. If the moon brings forth your doom, pray for the sun to return soon, or something like that. I pray to whoever the fuck is listening, God, Buddha, the sun, to return and burn these fucking things to ash. Please, Anne added. Crash. The rat on the hood of the car had broken the entire windshield out. I reached over and grabbed Anne's hand. I gave it a squeeze. Baby, I'm so sorry. I love you more than you'll ever know, I said, tears flooding my eyes. I love you too. Mac and I both, she blubbered. We closed our eyes and waited for the end. I knew the next thing I'd iffer. It wasn't. Just another layer of, what the hell? To an already well-layered, fuck this cake. Anne told me everything she could remember about the account she messaged with, but had limited information because who would bother to remember anything like that? She was hunting for a decent sale, not making a best friend. Turns out, she found neither. Everyone else has fallen asleep. I'm sitting in my office, staring at the carved sun and writing this out. I'm hoping someone out there might shed some light on this for me. Has anyone heard this song? Does anyone know anything about the crib, or how the moon and sun figure into it? Where was the land the piper was showing me? Shit, why was the Pied Piper part of it? How screwed up were my ancient relatives? Best as I can tell, and granted this is all speculation on my part, is that the song may have activated the crib. In turn, that awakened the face on the moon, which activated the piper. I don't know what the energy ball was. I have no clue how the person selling this thing tracked Anne down. I don't see how any of this, well, magic works. All I know is that this entire ordeal felt predetermined. I can't shake that feeling. That force is beyond my understanding and unconstrained by time and space, aligned in just a way to kill me off. The uneasy feeling that this was supposed to happen to me, like my bloodline was supposed to end tonight. What about my lineage pissed off the moon? What horrid curse is in my blood? And am I passing it down to Mac? We stopped the piper for now, but I'm worried he might return. I plan to hang the carved sun in Mac's room for protection, probably over his regular-ass Amazon Basics crib. The boy will be the centerpiece of the room, not his creepy German bed. It's silent in the house. Now, there's no piper music in my head, but I keep expecting to hear it again. He showed me some strange land, which must have been important to me or my family, right? He was trying to lure me somewhere, but where and why? I'm going to put on a pot of coffee. I'm not sleeping tonight, not until the sun rises anyway. I'll take all the protection I can get.